Chapter 8:10, Whose Cathedral a Cathedral? We came to the same judgment. Klein looked at the ruin ahead of him as he silently muttered to himself. At that moment, the tiny amount of crimson moonlight that penetrated the mist had scattered onto the collapsed building. Compared to before, it was a lot richer in color, almost approaching the color of blood. Klein maintained Gehrman Sparrow's trademark cold attitude as he said in an unperturbed manner, "Where did you previously explore?" As he spoke, Klein glanced at the lantern in the hanged man's hand, which remained unshattered despite all the ordeals. He subconsciously tensed up his muscles and skin when he saw the glow from the flame. Although the flame was ultimately contained by thick glass and metal frame, it still left him a little afraid. Alger didn't notice the minute changes in Gehrman Sparrow as he raised his dagger-wielding right hand and pointed at the grandest building amidst the ruin. There. All that was left of the building was its main structure. It was impossible to know what it originally looked like. The only things that could only be determined were that it had thick walls with narrow windows, and the building's scale and its magnificence. Furthermore, it once had a spire and clock tower. It had a Spartan facade and an ancient architecture. This is an architectural style from the early 4th epoch. There are records of these in the Church of Storm's canon. It's said that in that period, the various churches used such styles to build their cathedrals in a widespread fashion. Alger had a deep impression on the ruin. Over the years, he had flipped through many books and had acquired quite a bit of the background. Its greatest trait is the temple found above and the catacombs found below. Life and death were both unified here. However, I cannot confirm that the ancient cathedral's interior is as I described, as I've never ventured deep into it. This might be an architectural style left behind from the 3rd epoch. Klein made a guess as he walked straight to the opening of the ancient cathedral ruin's abnormally huge door. By keeping the lantern behind him, enjoying only the light emitted from it, he didn't need to suffer from his fear of fire. The duo quickly moved up the grayish-white stairs that were ridiculously high, and they arrived at the door's opening. Inside, they saw remnants of stone columns and arches that extended upwards towards the center. Klein wasn't in a rush to enter. He reached his left hand into his pocket and took out a gold coin as he allowed it to weave between his finger while seemingly muttering something. Suddenly, he flipped the gold coin and opened his palm to await its descent while saying to the hanged man, "How did you determine that deep in this cathedral is something of value that is not less than that of the cards of blasphemy?" After he said that, he looked at the gold coin that had fallen into his palm before putting it away. Alger pointed inside and said, "I've said before that my strength was inferior to Kalango's, and I didn't go as deep as he did." I had no idea what he saw, other than the judgment that there was something extremely precious and important inside from his remarks. Furthermore, it was something that only a true Sequence 5 could obtain. However, the murals near the entrance and the marks on the ground might be able to explain something. Klein nodded and walked through the dark door's opening that the crimson moonlight was unable to illuminate. The black trench coat he wore fluttered gently behind him as Alger held up a lantern and clenched his dagger while following behind. Passing through the opening, Klein used the crimson moonlight that shone in from the opening at the dome to see the hall of considerable depth up ahead. A few of the ancient stone columns supporting it had already snapped. At the end wasn't an altar, nor were there any staircases that led upwards. It was completely dark and difficult to tell the details. It appeared as though it led underground. It isn't a temple above and a catacomb beneath. The temple is underground in the catacombs? It's impossible to determine that. We'll know only by venturing down. Klein subconsciously glanced around and discovered side doors along the 2 sides, but the regions they led to had already completely collapsed with no usable path. The murals near the entrance and the marks on the ground, he recalled what the hanged man had just said, and he took 2 diagonal steps before releasing the invisible Wraith Senor. With his night vision, he began observing the remaining murals. The mural's background was of a towering and magnificent mountain. At its peak was a gigantic cross that was covered in a lustrous glow. In front of the cross were grand and abnormal figures that were clustered around. They were angels with 2 wings, 4 wings, or 6 wings. This Klein did a cursory glance and felt a strong sense of familiarity. He had seen a similar mural before, back in Blasphemer Amon's mausoleum. When he focused again, Klein quickly noticed the difference. There weren't the two infants that represented Amon and Adam, nor were there any 12-winged angels. The grand figure in front of the cross held its arms to its chest as it held an ancient, Spartan slate. The slate was drawn in an extremely indistinct manner, yet, it felt both ancient and young, holy and sinister. It was an extreme contradiction. Slate. Klein's pupils dilated slightly as a specific term flashed in his mind, blasphemy slate. This is likely that ancient sun god, the Lord that created everything which the city of silver worships. Indeed, the blasphemy slate is closely related to him. I wonder if this is the first blasphemy slate or the second. Klein roughly guessed at the cathedral's worshipped entity, and he also began to believe that the depths of the ruin hid items that were very valuable and important. He withdrew Seigneur's gaze and allowed the marionette to turn to face the ground. Apart from the slates being covered in cracks and some odd marks remaining, they were dark red in color, smaller than a human's forehead. They overlapped with one another at times as they extended all the way to the ends of the hall. At that instant, a scene naturally appeared in Klein's mind. Devout believers were prostrated on the ground as they proceeded forward, slamming their foreheads heavily onto the ground after covering a certain distance, leaving blood oozing out. Noticing Gehrman Sparrow look around without any scrutiny, Alger probed, the ancient sun god? At that moment, he felt the baffling sensation of a cold wind blowing from Gehrman Sparrow's side. He suspected that hidden around them were shadows or wraiths. Recalling the strange restraints the mutated curly-haired baboon was under, Alger made a vague theory that he didn't voice out. Upon hearing the hanged man's question, Klein had wanted to chuckle and reply, "You can also call him the Lord that created everything, the omnipotent and omniscient God," but he felt that such a tone and choice of words was closer to that of the fool and not Gehrman Sparrow. Hence, he held himself back and nodded slightly. "It's not hard to tell." Alger silently heaved a sigh of relief as he held a sense of anticipation for the item buried deep underneath the cathedral. The two simultaneously decided to walk towards the end of the hall. When they approached it, Klein finally saw the staircase that led downwards. "An underground area?" he asked succinctly. Alger shook his head. "I can't be sure. I've never gone down." Although Kalengos had attempted to venture in, he returned in less than 10 minutes with his aura becoming relatively weak. Klein nodded thoughtfully and said in passing, "You seem to be very familiar with him." If it were said by anyone else, Alger would have pretended to have not heard it or answered directly. But deep in his heart, the world Gehrman Sparrow was Mr. Fool's blessed. His question could possibly represent the intentions of that existence, so he needed to view them seriously. After deliberating for a few seconds, Alger said in a deep voice, "We were fellow townsmen, and we were servants at the same cathedral." The priest there was an easily irritated person who enjoyed punishing the servants. Kalengos couldn't bear it and escaped secretly to become a pirate. So there was such a past. Mr. Hanged Man is also a man with a story. Klein didn't probe deeper as he headed down the staircase in the extremely silent cathedral ruins. Although his footsteps were extremely light, they still sounded obvious in such an environment as they echoed. Soon, the two of them came to the end of the staircase and saw the opening of an arched door. On both sides of the opening were two shadows that stood there silently in an immutable fashion. Klein and Alger halted at the same time as they looked at the two shadows, only to discover that they were two stone statues. They were both men with their surface being grayish-white. One of them wore full-body armor that resembled a barrel, and the other wore a jacket that looked more contemporary. Their expressions were writhing in pain as their eyes protruded as though they were glaring at something. Upon seeing this scene, Klein realized something as he recalled the encounter outside. He and Alger had also shown signs of petrification, and it was thankful that they extricated themselves of the effects, or they might have really become statues. Don't tell me they're humans who met with the same situation. If we had been petrified, would we be moved down here, standing guard at this door opening for centuries or even millennia? The source of that petrifying power isn't afraid of these ruins? Klein felt explicable horror as his scalp tingled. He controlled his emotions and turned his head to look at the hanged man. He discovered that the pupils of the boorish man at sea had similarly dilated and was clutching the dagger tightly. Mr. Hanged Man has come to the same conclusion without me needing to speak further. Klein pointed at the door opening and said, "There might be even more stone statues inside." Alger nodded as he said worriedly and jokingly, "Let's hope we don't see ourselves. If we're convinced that we have escaped the effects of petrification, only to see our statues in this underground area, that would be quite the horror story." Klein thought for 2 seconds and said to the hanged man, "Do you have night vision?" His true meaning was that the light of the lantern was especially eye-catching in the dark catacombs and that it might easily cause unwanted developments. Therefore, it was best to extinguish the flame if he had night vision. And he believed that Mr. Hanged Man was able to read in between the lines. Alger replied frankly, "Yes." As a beyonder of the sailor pathway who could dive, it was a given that he had night vision. Klein glanced at him without a word, but his meaning was obvious. "Then why are you still using a lantern?" Alger seriously replied, "Firstly, it's to misdirect the enemy into instinctively believing that I don't have night vision because of my use of a lantern. When they destroy my lantern and try hard to create a dark environment, I'll give them a pleasant surprise." How sinister. Klein was momentarily at a loss for words. Alger continued, "Secondly, it's to avoid situations similar to the City of Silver. There might be extreme darkness lurking within complete darkness." Makes sense. Klein didn't insist that Alger extinguish the lantern as he first stepped past the 2 stone statues. Under their pain-frozen gazes, he stepped into the entrance that led underground. As he didn't know what the petrified statues represented, nor did he know if they were completely dead, Klein didn't attempt to shatter them to obtain their beyonder characteristics and mystical items. Chapter 8:11. The picture in the catacombs. After passing through the door opening and going underground, there wasn't a sliver of natural light in front of Klein and Alger. The ceiling was intact, preventing any crimson moonlight from seeping in after penetrating the mist. Alger raised the lantern in his hand, lighting up the area up ahead with a limited dim yellow glow. Klein took a glance and discovered at least 6 stone statues of both sexes. They were entirely grayish-white in color, and even their clothes looked like they were engraved. These stone statues included elves, giants, and humans that had an ancient dress sense. Apart from their frozen expressions of pain and despair, there wasn't anything similar. Klein felt a chill down his back when he saw their eyeballs watching him without moving, having made the connection that they were once alive. He felt that darkness ruled the depths of this passageway, as though a terrifying monster had widened its mouth as it lay in wait for the 2 to walk into its belly. Reining in their stirring emotions, Klein and Alger remained silent as they passed through the grayish-white statues with warped expression, and they proceeded forward. After walking for more than 10 seconds, Klein didn't need to use Señor's night vision to see the damaged and dark murals thanks to the lantern. There were a few murals that were relatively intact, allowing them to recognize what was being depicted. They were no doubt focused on the cross that glowed and the grand figure that stood before it. This blurry and solemn figure either faced cities that had been flooded, stepped upon fractured lands, or looked up at the starry sky where it locked eyes with the pairs of evil and maniacal eyes. When the apocalypse happens, the ancient sun god will rescue the world? This is somewhat similar to the murals that Little Sun and the others found in the true Creator's temple. Or perhaps it's just plagiarism from both sides, with no one giving up on working towards this goal. After all, it's to emphasize that they were once the Messiah and a deity worthy of one's faith. Klein quickly swept his gaze across the wall as he slowly entered the depths of the passageway. Alger was also observing the damaged murals when he suddenly suppressed his voice and said, "I suspect that the true, fallen creator's description of himself has references to some of the content here." Indeed, everyone has the same views. Klein lowered death knell and chuckled. "I won't be surprised if we see matters related to the true creator up ahead. That might be a particular connection between him and the creator that the City of Silver believes in." Alger agreed with Gehrman Sparrow's judgment. The duo continued ahead as they tried hard to soften their steps. However, there were still some echoes that reverberated in that extremely silent environment. At this moment, Klein's spiritual perception was triggered. He immediately took 2 steps forward and put himself in front of Alger, blocking out most of the lantern's light. Less than 2 seconds later, he heard a dull sound emitting from afar. Thump. 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 The ground shook gently as the sounds became clearer. Then, Klein saw a figure nearly 4 meters tall walk out. It was also grayish-white in color, with armor plating patterns engraved on its body. Its head had goat horns and a mouth that resembled a hound's. Its half-opened mouth revealing snarling fangs. And what attracted attention the most were its pair of eyes which burned red and the 6 pairs of white membraned wings. Thump. 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 The monster held an 8-meter-long stone trident as it slowly entered a passageway. It shook the land with every step as its great weight was spread out. Although Klein hadn't seen it before, he instantly recognized what it was. It was a 6-winged gargoyle. Its core crystal was one of the main ingredients of a marionettist, and the beyonder powers it possessed were extremely special and indefensible. Based on its external build and from what it's made of, it definitely has extremely potent combat strength while not being afraid of most damage. All it needs to cause terrifying damage is to storm over and perform a downward smash with its stone trident. Klein relaxed his left hand and wasn't in a rush to react. He and Alger remained on the spot, one using his body, and the other using his clothes to conceal the lantern's light. Thump. 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 The 6-winged gargoyle didn't look towards the duo, and it instead passed through the passageway, its footsteps slowly distancing themselves from them. Indeed, it's not very perceptive. It's no wonder Kalangos was able to venture deep down and return safely. Klein proceeded forward again when the footsteps were undetectable as he went past the crossroads. In fact, with his current strength and gear, and his understanding of his target, killing a 6-winged gargoyle wasn't something too dangerous. Furthermore, the hanged man could provide him with help. The reason why he gave up attacking it was because he had no idea how many 6-winged gargoyles there were in the catacombs. Once a battle ensued, any large commotion could result in them swarming over. When that happened, they could only escape using traveling. In addition, if they were to stir the existence in the ruins that even nearby beyonder creatures were afraid of, the problem would only worsen. Curbing one's greed was a premise for a risky exploration. Alger was also rather pleased at the crazy adventurer's calm and rational actions. His suspicion was that Gehrman Sparrow was under the orders of Mr. Fool, thus, resisting his urge to attack the 6-winged gargoyle. The calmer he appears, the crazier he will be when he encounters his true target. As this thought flashed in Alger's mind, he followed Gehrman Sparrow straight down the crossroads. The murals on both sides remained damaged, and they were still describing the greatness and holiness of the ancient sun god. Finally, Klein and Alger arrived at the ends of the passageway. Here, there was an 8-meter-tall stone double door. It depicted various symbols of death, sleep, end, new birth, and beginnings. A tomb? Klein turned to say to Alger. Alger nodded and said, it might also be a temple. Clearly, he was also wondering if it was both a temple and tomb. The grayish-white stone door before the duo wasn't shut completely. It was cracked open with a tiny gap that allowed a child passage. Alger glanced at the floor and walked over. Putting the lantern down and securing his dagger, he pressed his hands onto one side of the door. He slowly drew a breath as he bent his knees, his arm muscles swelling suddenly. Silently, the gap widened significantly. Klein pricked up his brows when he saw this scene, feeling somewhat astonished because the hanged man's pushing of the door didn't produce any sound at all. He didn't doubt an ocean songster's strength, but he didn't believe that it could prevent the stone door from making contact with the ground. As he moved his gaze down, Klein saw a pool of slightly sticky liquid gathered under the door. He quietly produced a lubricant effect. Mr. Hanged Man is very meticulous. Is this the power of a seafarer or an ocean songster? He probably also used the powers of a wind blast to control an air cushion, thus, resulting in this door silently opening. Klein roughly figured out the reason. Although he approached the stone door, he wasn't eager to enter it. Through the widened gap, he observed the scene inside. Reflected in the eyes of the wraith was the corner of the room where there was a row of grayish-white stone coffins. It is indeed a catacomb. As for whether it's also a temple, it's an unknown for now. As Klein thought, he took out Lamino's travels with his left hand. On it were beyonder powers that were suitable to handle matters related to the death domain. Meanwhile, he used a silver dagger to quickly create a wall of spirituality and sealed the iron cigar case to prevent Azek's copper whistle from causing the dead to rise from their graves. Alger also drew his dagger again and placed his left palm over it before sliding his palm outwards. Amidst light crackling sounds, the dagger swirled with silver bolts of lightning that snaked outwards. Having made their preparations, Klein, who was acting as the crazy adventurer, Gehrman Sparrow, was first to pass through the door and into the tomb. Of course, Wraith Senor had already acted as a scout by circling the tomb before he entered. To a marionettist, there was no need to take risks on many matters once they had a marionette. The tomb's ceiling was soaked with water droplets, a clear indication of the humidity. The room was divided into two regions that each had 12 grayish-white stone coffins. In the middle was a circular region where there appeared to be a beautiful and complicated picture placed on the ground. Klein didn't approach it as he stopped Alger. Then, he controlled Senor to appear as it quickly floated to a spot above the circular region. Admiral of Blood. Alger's facial muscles twitched. Although he had already guessed so, he couldn't stop his subconscious reactions when he saw it with his own eyes. At this moment, Senor descended and was able to fully take in the scene in the central region. The picture had dark, dull colors with the background being filled with blurry figures. In the foreground was a long table. On the table was a figure with a resplendent cross glowing from it, and surrounding the figure were three people shrouded in shadows. One was handsome and youthful, another solemn and bold, and the last looking wise with his white beard. The three pairs of eyes exuded an indescribable sense of evil, just like the actions of their owners. One of them had ripped off the figure's arm, stuffing it into their mouths, and gnawing at it as blood was filling his mouth. Another held up a brain and sucked at its juices, while the last had dug out a beating heart, chewing at it in a ravenous manner. In contrast to them, in the figure's chest was a long and wide crack. Sitting cross-legged in there was a dark and sinister infant who was masticating on the intestines that had fresh blood gushing down. These four entities seemed to sense someone prying into their act as they looked up in unison, as though they were staring at any being that placed their eyes on the picture. Chapter 8:12, Myth from Another Perspective. Upon clearly seeing the picture through Senor's vision, Klein's heart raced so loudly that even he could hear it. As a seer who was good at interpreting revelations and symbolism, he felt his blood gush to his head, leaving his head swelling. It seemed to prevent him from engaging in thinking deeper into it. Even so, there was an ethereal voice belonging to him that resounded in his mind. It was filled with alarm. That figure that's dismembered and eaten likely represents the ancient sun god, the Lord that created everything, the omnipotent and omniscient God which the City of Silver believes in. And I've seen the three evil figures surrounding him before. In the underground ruin in Backland, the place that sealed that terrifying evil spirit. They existed in the form of a statue but didn't look as evil as the picture depicts them to be. They each respectively represent the eternal blazing sun, the Lord of storms, and the God of knowledge and wisdom. Suddenly, Klein recalled the name he had once received, one that he had directly received when looking straight at the eternal blazing sun, White Angel. No way. Could it be that the eternal blazing sun was once an angel by the ancient sun god's side? Little Sun once mentioned that they heard an ecclesiastic's penitence and prophesy of a matter in Afternoon Town. One of the sentences was, the kings often came to the palace belonging to the dusk to conspire. The eternal blazing sun was originally named White Angel, which is also a king of angels, one that betrayed that creator. And he, and the Lord of storms, the God of knowledge and wisdom, and the dark infant who I have no idea what it represents had benefited the most out of consuming the city of silver's creator. The Bibles of the various churches mention that the three most ancient deities were born from the original creator's spirit. In a sense, it's actually hinting at this dark history. If my theories are correct, then the Lord of Storms and the God of Knowledge and Wisdom are likely the kings of angels that serve the Creator, the ancient sun god, who the City of Silver worships. Perhaps they should be addressed as Wind Angel and Wisdom Angel. This way, all 8 kings of angels are accounted for: Dark Angel, White Angel, Wind Angel, Wisdom Angel, Angel of Imagination, Angel of Time, Angel of Fate, and Red Angel. From what little Sun heard, and from the subsequent developments of these kings of angels, it seems that apart from the 2 sons of God, Ammon and Adam, the other kings of angels had betrayed the Creator. No way, this ancient sun god ended way too tragedy. However, this picture might not be real. It might be sacrilege. It's still suspect. I wonder who the dark infant sitting in the ancient sun god's abdomen represents. It feels like the true creator is the greatest suspect. Klein instantly thought of many matters as he felt the urge to leave and pretend that he hadn't seen the picture the deeper he pondered over the matter. At that instant, he felt an irrepressible sense of fear, to the point of feeling that the eternal blazing sun, the Lord of Storms, and the God of Knowledge and Wisdom were casting their gaze down from the astral world in his imagination. Who left this picture behind? Who could have known so many secrets and clearly be on the ancient sun god's side? One of the other angels or saints that have been constantly following the City of Silver creator with enduring faith? Klein's back oozed with sweat as his body trembled slightly. Although Alger's observational abilities were inferior to Miss Justice, he was an experienced beyonder. In this environment that needed a high sense of vigilance and awareness, it wasn't difficult for him to notice that something odd had happened to Gehrman Sparrow. What happened? He asked with a suppressed tone. Klein suddenly snapped to his senses as he made Seigneur move his gaze away as he pointed at the circular region in the middle. You'll know just by looking at it. A picture that can make Gehrman tremble? Will it make me lose control immediately? It's probably not a problem since he's not stopping me but suggesting that I take a look. However, I cannot eliminate the possibility that he has already lost his reasoning and is just acting normal. Many thoughts flashed through Alger's mind, but ultimately, he steadily walked towards the central region with his lantern in hand. After about 8 steps, he saw the gloomy picture. In just 3 seconds, Alger's hands trembled with the dagger and lantern in his grip. It was as though he was suffering from some kind of mental illness. Thanks to the world Gehrman, he had once seen the 6 Orthodox deities' anthropomorphic statues in the Tarot Club. He naturally recognized that the arm-eating, heart-ripping, and brain-guzzling figures were respectively the Lord of Storms, the eternal blazing sun, and the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. In the past, he had committed a disloyal act to the church whilst under Kalangos's coercion. He joined the Tarot Club and distanced himself from the chasm of storm, believed in Mr. Fool and wished to gain more strength and power, and he leaked the church's intel and was unmotivated in certain matters. Even so, he ultimately believed himself to be a believer of the Lord of Storms, albeit someone who wasn't devout and passionate enough. But at that moment, he felt deep down in his heart that he had committed a grave sin of sacrilege. He nearly dug out his eyes in horror. To not kill myself directly, it means that I really have become a false believer. Alger didn't dare take another look as he turned around and looked at Gehrman Sparrow. With a trembling voice, he asked, "Those 3 are kings of angels?" "I can't give you confirmation. All I can say is that the eternal blazing sun is intimately connected to the white angel," Klein vaguely answered. As expected. Alger immediately felt that the possibility that the Lord of Storms, the eternal blazing sun, and the God of Knowledge and Wisdom were once kings of angels. As for Gehrman Sparrow not being able to confirm the situation, he wasn't too surprised. It wasn't odd since he was only a blessed and not Mr. Fool. Alger was just about to say something when he heard a sharp screech. It was as though someone was using their fingernails to scratch the lid of a stone coffin. No, it wasn't an analogy, and it was exactly what was happening. Swing. Rip. Sizzle. Sharp, jarring sounds of scratching sounded from 3 stone coffins on both sides. Then, the heavy lids were either flung open or blasted open as 3 warped figures stood up. One of them wore an ancient white robe that had nearly turned gray. Its face was riddled with pockmarks, and across its neck, forehead, and the back of its hands were deep eyes. Beside it was a figure with huge palms and thick fingers that looked as though they were made of wood. Slathered around its body was a layer of yellow-green pus as a mist of the same color emanated out of it, seemingly capable of eroding away the stone coffin. Opposite the two was a figure in a tattered brown jacket with a triangular hat with a skull on it. Many parts of its skin had rotted away, revealing the bone beneath. Under its clothes and pants, thick and slimy tentacles that had fish scales embedded inside had burrowed out as it released a domineering, savage, tyrannous, and terrifying aura. This even made Klein feel as though he was facing a high-sequence beyonder from the storm pathway. However, its body didn't appear to reach that level. The 3 deceased bodies that crawled out of the coffin cast their eyes in the direction of Gehrman Sparrow and Alger. One produced silver bolts of lightning that crackled. Another reflected the duo's figures in the countless eyes it had. The last one spread its yellow-green mist and created brown vines. At the same time, they stormed over with loud and hurried footsteps as a 6-winged gargoyle was rushing over. Upon seeing this, Klein didn't panic. His Laymanos Travels wielding left hand reached into his pocket, tore open the wall of spirituality, and used 2 fingers to pick out Azek's copper whistle. Right on the heels of that, he flicked his wrist and threw the copper whistle to the other side of the room. Without any surprises, he saw the 3 deceased bodies with terrifying auras turn around and rush towards it like trained hounds. Upon seeing this scene, Alger's gaze froze before he made a decision. He threw his lantern and rushed for the door. His experience told him that while Gehrman Sparrow could deal with the 3 terrifying deceased, he needed to hold back the 6-winged gargoyle to prevent it from interfering with the crazy adventurer's battle. Bang! Just as Alger arrived at the door, he saw the double door crack. A 6-winged gargoyle was charging in with an 8-meter-long trident. He immediately drew a gasp as his eyes burned with rage. His muscles swelled, and under the aid of the wind, he charged forward and brandished the dagger that swirled with silver lightning. Bang! He dodged the stone trident that smashed downwards, and he cleaved at the gargoyle's abdomen with a dagger. Instantly, sparks flew as rubble sprayed everywhere. Alger flew backwards as the gargoyle's charge was disrupted. Bang! Alger heavily slammed into the ground. As he had created an air cushion in time, he didn't suffer any serious injuries. And at this moment, the 3 deceased bodies had gathered together to vie for Azek's copper whistle. Klein looked at them and calmly flipped Laymanos Travels to a charred yellow page with complicated patterns and symbols. This was a demigod-level power that he recently recorded, Lightning Storm. Then, Klein slid 1 finger across the notebook page with his death knell-wielding hand. At the same time, he looked at the 3 mutated deceased bodies who were vying for Azek's copper whistle. With a deep voice, he greeted them, "Bye-bye." Amidst sizzling sounds, bolts of lightning burst forth, meshing together to form a hurricane, enveloping the region where Azek's copper whistle was, as well as the 3 deceased bodies. The entire tomb was instantly lit up like it was daytime. Even Alger nearly failed to open his eyes. His body instinctively trembled as a result of the terrifying aura. With the aid of the wind, he leaped up with the hurricane taking form in his eyes. He once again charged at the 6-winged gargoyle that attempted to attack Gehrman Sparrow. Chapter 8:13. Tyrant. Aside from the Sailor Pathway's raging blow, Alger knew that he didn't have any powers that were adequate against the 6-winged gargoyle's strong body due to its immunity to lightning strikes. Of course, directly creating a resonance with its hearing organs and body of heart and mind through the use of his singing was the most effective method. If this encounter had been anywhere else, Alger definitely would have exploited the gargoyle's great weight and lack of agility to circle around it. Then, as he sang to effect it, he would attack the same spot with sharp wind blades, slowly grinding away at his enemy through the cumulative damage over time. But now, he was in a catacomb, and due to the environment's limitations, any acts of directly avoiding it would only cause the gargoyle to turn its gaze to Gehrman Sparrow. It would then attack the crazy adventurer with its 8-meter-long trident, preventing him from seizing the opportunity to finish off the 3 deceased bodies. And most important of all, Alger suspected that his singing will have more adverse effects on Gehrman Sparrow than what the gargoyle was capable of. Bang! The stone trident crashed heavily into the ground, blasting open an exaggerated crater. It left the catacomb shaking as if an earthquake had happened. As for Alger, he didn't attempt to parry it. With the help of strong winds, he dodged to the right and soared up, agilely dodging the gargoyle's attack as he dashed for the monster's head. At that moment, he saw the grayish-white eyes which burned with flames. Alger's mind turned sluggish as his body instantly stiffened. He had the feeling of being petrified again, but his skin didn't show signs of spreading grayish-white colors. Thanks to the inertia, he continued soaring upwards, but he wasn't able to brandish his dagger. He slammed straight into the gargoyle's head before loudly being repelled backward, his body aching in pain. The heavy grayish-white trident reflected in his eyes again as his thoughts were sluggish, making it impossible for him to put up any effective resistance. Suddenly, a hand grabbed him by the shoulder and pulled him to the side. Bang! Rubble flew as sparks were produced. The gargoyle's heavy trident had blasted open a huge crater again. Alger's body trembled as his vision regained its clarity while his thoughts were rapidly restored back to normal. He was like someone who woke up from an irresistible nightmare which he was helpless against as he regained control over his body. Only then did he realize that Gehrman Sparrow had appeared by his side. There were still remnant flashes of lighting and sizzling sounds in the corner where the 3 deceased bodies were. Do not lock gazes with it. Attack its chest. As Klein pulled Alger away quickly in a bid to dodge the stone trident, he succinctly advised his companion. Alger had personally experienced and witnessed many battles, so without further explanation from Gehrman Sparrow, he knew what the latter meant. He stopped receiving aid as he nimbly circled to the gargoyle's flank. Tap! 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 He ran towards the gargoyle and waited for the stone trident to sweep over him, before soaring high up with the help of the strong gales to dodge the attack. Whoosh! Another hurricane pushed Alger towards the gargoyle's chest. During this process, he closed his eyes, pulled back his right arm, and bulged his muscles. Then, with his ability to judge distances as a seafarer, he threw out his dagger-wielding right fist. Howling wind blades and sizzling lightning were emitted along with his fist. Bang! Alger's right fist heavily struck the gargoyle's chest, producing an explosive effect. It caused the gargoyle's stone to be covered in fine cracks as silver lightning snaked around. Following that, the cracks widened and depressed into a pit. With a cracking sound, his dagger exploded, turning into countless fragments that scattered everywhere. The strong recoil sent Alger flying back. In midair, he saw through the corner of his eye that the hatted Gehrman Sparrow had at some point in time circled to the front and cocked his revolver. Right on the heels of that, the cold adventurer suddenly raised his hand and aimed the black barrel right at the gargoyle. Bang! Amidst a loud echo, a bullet tore through the pit in the gargoyle's chest and pierced it. Following the explosive boom, the grayish-white stone monster convulsed a few times before the flames in its eyes were extinguished. After a brief pause, it collapsed like a mountain, producing an exaggerated sound and earthquake-like shaking. Death Knell had delivered a lethal blow. And at this moment, Alger had just maintained his balance and found his footing thanks to the wind. Klein didn't speak to him or search for the spoils of war. He immediately turned around and headed for the charred area where Azek's copper whistle sat silently. Slippery tentacles covered in fish scales moved as the deceased body with nearly half its body gone had stood up. Bolts of lightning continued snaking around its body. It was the domineering, savage, tyrannous deceased body that wore a tattered brown jacket with a triangular captain's hat. It was missing its left arm and right leg, as well as having half its head. Its body was covered in traces of charred and melted flesh. But even so, it didn't sleep in peace. It was still attempting to fuse with the surrounding flesh and blood in order to obtain a stronger state. One had to know that Klein had used lightning storm, which he had recorded from the sea god scepter. Even if the act of recording had reduced its might, it was definitely the beyonder power at the demigod level. Just the fact that the other two deceased went silent without letting out a grunt was a testament of its might. This awakened deceased body is problematic. Klein's heart stirred as he made Senor leap onto the smooth surface of Azek's copper whistle before attempting to reflect onto the deceased fish scale on its slippery tentacle. At that moment, through the marionette, Klein sensed a tyrannical and high-level repulsive force. The wraith was unable to possess it. Senor was even repelled as it couldn't help but lose its invisibility. Upon seeing this, Alger didn't question the situation. He raised his hands and created a spiraling wind around the deceased body, hoping to restrain its actions. However, the wind didn't sweep inwardly, as though it was afraid of something. It was forcefully dissipated as it rapidly vanished. The only thing to be happy about was that the deceased body didn't immediately attack the duo. Instead, it jumped to the left, bent its back, and attempted to pick up Azek's copper whistle. Klein immediately flicked his wrist and precisely flipped Lamino's travels to the page with abyss shackles. This was a beyonder power which Emlyn had recorded, one belonging to a sequence 7 vampire. As Klein swiped his death knell-wielding right hand onto the notebook, the shadows around the deceased body suddenly came to life and manifested chains that shackled it firmly to the ground. Taking advantage of his opponent's brief pause, Klein raised his revolver in a deadpan manner. Different colors, red, green, and white, immediately appeared in his vision. Aiming at the white, Klein pulled the trigger. Bang! A pale golden beam shot into the head of the deceased body, causing it to rupture immediately into a spray of blood. At the same time, the purifying bullet also emitted a sun-like radiance that illuminated the target's body. The deceased body melted like wax as it bent its waist and lost its balance, collapsing right beside Azek's copper whistle. Monsters without any intelligence that only move on instinct are much easier to deal with than beyonders of the same level. However, am I letting the copper whistle down? Ever since it was given to me, it has suffered explosions, the catharsis of lightning, and the purification of sunlight. Life sure isn't easy for it. Klein repented for a second before controlling Senor to pick up the ancient and exquisite copper whistle and stuffing it inside his body. He didn't directly head over, afraid that a deceased body would awaken. Hence, he continued letting Senor to investigate the fellow who could resist the possession effect. Klein suspected that the deceased had an item of a rather high level. Soon, Senor in his non-wraith form touched something and pulled it out. It was a card. On the face of the card was a man wearing a papal tiara with both hands held up. Before him were prostrated believers, and behind him was lightning, dark clouds, gales, and waves. Klein was very familiar with the man because he had a portrait of this person in another set of attire. It was Emperor Roselle. And to the top left of the pontiff dressed Roselle, there was a line of text formed from resplendent starlight, Sequence 0, Tyrant. The card of blasphemy from the storm pathway. The Tyrant card? Klein instantly recalled how the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom addressed the Lord of Storms, Tyrant. Alger also saw the card of blasphemy as his gaze froze instantly. Flames of greed flared up in his eyes. He took a deep breath and moved his gaze away as he looked to the side and said, "The battle was intense. Perhaps other entities deep inside this cathedral have been awoken by us. So, let's store away the things as quickly as possible and prepare to leave." "Mr. Hanged Man, do you think I'm not aware of that? There's no need for you to nag. What happened to our tacit teamwork from before?" Indeed. The Tyrant card has affected you. You can hardly calm down, and you have become talkative." As Klein got Wraith Senor to pick up the card of blasphemy and enter one of the deceased bodies to accelerate the production of the Beyonder characteristic, he coldly said, "You've already wasted 5 seconds. Alger was taken aback. Without saying another word, he walked to the remains of the 6-winged gargoyle and dug out the eyeball that glowed red. Then, He patiently waited for a moment and reached into its shattered back to extract a gargoyle translucent crystal. Elsewhere, with the wraith's help, the deceased body that was covered with yellow-green pus produced a blob of brown soil. It had roots to it with hidden blood vessels. It appeared rather strange. Without wasting time to guess at the sequence or pathway it belonged to, Klein got Seigneur to store it away before heading for the deceased body whose slippery tentacles were still twitching slightly, to accelerate the production of the Beyonder characteristic. Seeing what looked like a jellyfish with azure blue seawater in it take form, Klein and Alger suddenly heard a dragged-out sound. Sigh. This sighing came from deep within the cathedral, bringing along with it an indescribable sense of ancientness. Chapter 8:14. Disappeared. The long sigh that sounded from deep within the cathedral had left the back muscles of Klein and Alger tense as they were pumped with adrenaline. Without any hesitation, Klein's left glove turned transparent as he vanished, appearing beside the hanged man. As he reached out to grab his shoulder, Seigneur also picked up the jellyfish-like Beyonder characteristic and, with the help of Mirror Leap, returned back to the gold coin inside the iron cigar case. Right on the heels of that, Klein's and Alger's bodies turned incorporeal and invisible, leaving the catacombs silent again. The two of them were directly teleported into midair a distance away. Their figures came into existence amidst the shadows of the clouds and the crimson moonlight. Subconsciously, Klein and Alger turned their heads in unison to look at the primitive island, wishing to know if any changes would happen to it. When they heard that sigh, they had relied on their instincts and experience to immediately escape despite not sensing any actual danger. Now, they couldn't help but feel curious and puzzled. In their vision, the thick mist that cloaked the primitive island had quickly dispersed. The moonlight shone straight down without anything obstructing it. Amidst howling winds, Klein and Alger floated in midair as they saw the primitive island's present state through the sparse mist. It had vanished. This primitive island that had a demigod feathered serpent and all kinds of Beyonder creatures had vanished. The region it was in had dark blue seawater which was almost black was ebbing slightly. Nothing appeared out of the ordinary. Alger couldn't help but reach his hand into his pocket where he touched the six-winged gargoyle's core crystal that had left his mind sluggish. If not for his battle spoils still being in existence, he would have suspected if it was all a dream. He wondered if he and Gehrman Sparrow had somewhat gotten lost, that they hadn't found the real primitive island, and ended up completing the exploration in their dreams. Klein had similar thoughts as well. He even felt as though he was hallucinating. After all, a giant island with so many powerful creatures that hid secrets from mythical times couldn't just vanish without a word. Even the seawater didn't show any corresponding signs of its existence. Thankfully, I didn't hesitate at all and chose to immediately escape. Otherwise, Mr. Hanged Man and I might really vanish, never to be found again. Klein suddenly felt a deep sense of joy. He didn't dare stay any longer as he activated traveling once again and vanished with Alger as they traversed the spirit world. And the final scene of this body of water that froze in their eyes was of mist spreading once again with increasing density. After another teleportation, Klein and Alger returned to the deserted island. They stood on a reef and watched the waves strike the shore loudly. Alger looked around and heaved a silent sigh of relief. He took out the core crystal of the six-winged gargoyle and said, "This is a shared spoil of war. You get to choose first." After weighing the matter, he considered the six-winged gargoyle to be a monster that the duo had killed together. As for the three deceased bodies, they were solely Gehrman Sparrows. Klein didn't directly respond. He made Seigneur float beside him as he took out the tyrant card, the brown soil Beyonder characteristic, and the jellyfish-like Beyonder characteristic. The latter was suspected to be that of an ocean songster's. After doing all of this, he said, "One battle. I'll choose first." Thrice. He meant that in the battle the duo faced, they had fought three deceased bodies and a six-winged gargoyle. He had contributed greatly in the entire battle, so the spoils of war received in the tomb belonged to the pool. Of course, based on the contributions, Gehrman Sparrow had the right to choose first and choose 3 consecutive times. Alger was taken aback as he gained a new understanding of the crazy adventurer. He then nodded. Okay. Klein immediately reached his hand towards his marionette and calmly took the tyrant card with Roselle's face on it. This counts as twice. With the card of blasphemy, along with the sea god scepter, he could barely be considered a fake demigod when taking action in his spirit-body state. This was also very useful when acting as sea god. Of course, the greatest value the tyrant card provided was the high-sequence potion formulas of the storm pathway, as well as the subtle ability to sense the ingredients needed after reaching sequence 4. And it was precisely because of this that Klein didn't wait till they returned to the city of generosity, Biyao, to split the spoils of war. He was afraid that the tyrant card would directly attract Sea King John Cotman. It's up to you to say how many times it counts. Alger didn't retort, nor did he plan on objecting to Gehrman Sparrow's claim. He watched as Gehrman reached for the jellyfish-like Beyonder characteristic which likely corresponded to Ocean Songster. To Klein, it could be used to create a mystical item in the storm domain, thus, replacing the Murloc cufflink that had been taken away by Admiral Hell. It could also be bestowed to the Rorstad Archipelago's resistance in the future to raise their survivability at sea. Of course, the condition was that they had greatly pleased Sea God. Putting away the tyrant card and the jellyfish-like Beyonder characteristic, Klein glanced at the hanged man, indicating that it was his turn to choose. Alger deliberated and said, "Can I choose the sequence 4 potion formula from that card of blasphemy?" "No problem." Klein nodded without much of an expression. "I'll give it to you in the future." Although the tyrant card had been activated, using it was bound to cause quite a stir. Therefore, to be safe, Klein planned on heading above the grey fog to study it after he returned to Backlund. All right. Even with Alger's stateliness, he couldn't help but smile. After this adventure, once his digestion of the ocean songster was almost done, he could showcase his strength and take the path of being advanced by the church. When the time came, drinking an additional potion wasn't a big problem. Even if he didn't give birth to a child, just time alone could allow him to resolve the matter completely. The key obstacle was that going from sequence 5 to sequence 4 was a qualitative transformation. It was a sublimation of life's natural order. Countless ocean songsters in the Church of Storms had worked hard for decades, but they had failed to obtain an opportunity. Alger didn't believe that he, as a mixed blood, one who had promoted himself from a servant, would receive any special treatment. He felt that not being ostracized was already something to be happy about, a result of his ability to build social ties. Furthermore, in the church, the potion was directly given for the advancement to sequence 4. There was no advanced understanding of the formula or its preparation. For Alger to gain an advantage in this intense competition, he had to have other ideas apart from being ranked within the top 3 in terms of contributions. His present line of thought was to kill a famous pirate. From him, he could obtain the cataclysmic inter's potion formula. Then, he could let the clues point towards the mutated deceased body in the primitive island. It was likely a powerful pirate who had once been active at sea before suddenly vanishing. This way, the upper echelons of the Church of Storms would definitely suspect that this powerful missing pirate had obtained the card of blasphemy, and this undeniable reality could be verified via many different means. Alger could use the advantage of already knowing the cataclysmic inter's potion formula to obtain a chance to become a sequence 4. Of course, that's working on the premise that the church doesn't have a sealed artifact that can directly wipe out any corresponding memories. If this method doesn't work, and there's no real way to advance, I can only secretly gather the corresponding ingredients and prepare the required ritual for advancement. Once I become a sequence 4, I'll immediately leave the church and become a pirate king. Alger reined in his thoughts and watched as Gehrman Sparrow took away the brown soil-like Beyonder characteristic. Glancing at the remaining items, he put away the grayish-white translucent crystal and handed the 6-winged gargoyle's eyeball to Gehrman Sparrow. With him not lacking any powerful offensive means, and him being well-rounded when it came to the sea and land, it was rather useful for him if the Beyonder ingredient could be made into a mystical item. Back in the tomb, if it wasn't because he was uncertain if psychic piercing could affect the gargoyle, and the battle situation didn't allow for any mistakes, he would have chosen to first use the whip of mind. After splitting the spoils of war, putting them in different boxes, and sealing them with walls of spirituality, Klein stored away Senor. Reaching out his hand to grab the hanged man, their figures turned faint as they entered the spirit world. After the traveling was completed, the two appeared on a mountain beside the sea in the Biyao city outskirts. It was still close to the cemetery, and it was as though they had never left. Alger didn't harp on the topic as he nodded at German Sparrow. If you need any mystical items created, I shall bear the corresponding costs. It's a pleasure working with you. Wearing the transparent glove, Klein tersely answered before vanishing. He left the hanged man behind, and he directly teleported himself to a secluded corner in Biyao City. Next, I need to select a lucky pirate. Klein surveyed his area as he muttered silently and stretched his fingers before walking out into the street. Of course, he didn't forget to change his appearance. He also smeared blood over Lamino's travels. After all, there were bounty notices everywhere for German Sparrow, and Sea King John Cotman remained in this city. If he were recognized or got lost, things would be nasty. On the mountainside outside the city, Alger looked up at the dark night where there were the crimson moon and the countless stars. He slowly inhaled and exhaled, allowing the refreshing and saltiness of the seaside to cleanse his body. The exploration he had just completed was the most dangerous adventure he had ever had. If not for the teleportation from German Sparrow's creeping hunger, he doubted that they could escape alive. However, as Mr. Fool's blessed, the world should have other trump cards. For example, those demigod-level beyonder powers in Lamino's travels. But in that case, we might not have successfully reached the tomb, with us encountering more trouble along the way. Yes, that card of blasphemy of the storm pathway is the target that made him restrain his madness. Was an instruction from Mr. Fool? He had already foreseen it. Perhaps, he even knows the existence that produced that sigh from deep within the cathedral. Back then Kalangos might have seen the tyrant card but had lacked the ability to obtain it. That must be why he said that. Alger's mind churned as he slowly walked to the foot of the mountain. Chapter 8:15, After Action Review. Backlund, 160 Backlund Street. German Sparrow's figure suddenly appeared inside his bedroom as his black trench coat fluttered while his half-top hat remained straight. The Dwayne Dantes lying in bed immediately turned incorporeal, receding into a palm-sized mirror. Probably no one came tonight. Rhodes didn't cause any trouble. Upon seeing the peace and quiet, Klein secretly heaved a sigh of relief as his body grew a lot taller and his sideburns turned gray. His blue eyes deepened as he transformed into Dwayne Dantes. Meanwhile, watery waves stirred in the mirror as silver light gathered to outline words. Great Master, I didn't do anything today. No, I seriously acted as the sleeping Dwayne Dantes. In addition, I encountered something. Do you wish to know what it was? Ignoring Rhodes's desire to be praised in its first sentence, Klein felt his heart skip a beat. As he took off his hat and threw it on the reclining chair beside him, he said in a deep voice, "Tell me." The words on the mirror disintegrated and squirmed into new text. A lady peeped into this house when she was walking past this street. How does that matter? There are plenty of people who admire the surroundings when passing by every day. Klein was just about to say something when the aqueous light stirred on the mirror's surface, outlining a figure. The person was dressed quite oddly in the eyes of normal people. She wore a spirit medium's black robe. Her eyeshadow and blush were blue. She looked beautiful, but she also had an uncanny appearance. She was none other than Daly Simone. This lady had turned her head to look out as she passed by Unit 160 while on a carriage moving down Backlund Street. She had stared out for more than 3 seconds. Man, she not only had an impression of Dwayne Dantes because of his eyes, but she has also grasped something about the situation? Klein frowned slightly and asked, anything else? No. As Rhodes presented the word, it sketched what symbolized a sworn oath. Klein nodded and ignored the mirror's passion. He then sent it away. After doing all of this, Klein took out a candle and set up a ritual. He summoned and responded to himself, bringing all the spoils of war and his clothes above the gray fog. He planned on separating Gehrman Sparrow's and Dwayne Dantes' clothes. He didn't wish to miss out on any details in the future. Pa! He snapped a finger and made the candlewick burn with a scarlet flame. 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 Klein's gaze froze as he quickly closed his eyes and turned around, his back facing the candle. Then, he controlled Senor to approach the desk. During this process, Senor's body trembled violently, but he ultimately reached out his right hand to extinguish the fire. I'll sleep for the night and think about it tomorrow. No, I have the tyrant card on me, and it has already been activated. Although there's the wall of spirituality to seal it, it might not be able to fully screen out the attraction force from those of the same pathway. It might only weaken its influence and take more time. Back when I was in Biyao, I came and went quickly, without daring to stay too long. Just as Klein calmed down, he thought of certain problems. A few seconds later, he slowly took a deep breath, raised his hand, and snapped his fingers to light the candle. Following that, he held back the horror in him as he controlled Senor to take another 2 candles to set up the sacrificial ritual. This way, it skipped the step of him responding to the summoning for the entrance to the real world via the flame. After everything was done, Klein turned around with great difficulty as he piously lowered his head. Without looking into the candlelight, he seriously chanted the honorific name of the fool. Via sheer willpower, to the point of him bursting out in tears, he finally completed the ritual and sacrificed all the items, sending them above the gray fog. Phew. Klein exhaled, taking 4 steps counterclockwise, he arrived at the silent mysterious space. Sitting in the fool's seat, he first picked up the tyrant card, and he triggered the content hidden within. The card of blasphemy immediately became 3-dimensional, like a palm-sized book. As he flipped through the pages, each page had a Roselle Gustave. He was either playing the role of a sailor, or he was wearing a captain's hat and holding a sextant, otherwise, he was singing loudly with the sea as his background. Klein was rendered speechless by this sight. He felt increasingly convinced that his fellow Earthling was way too narcissistic. I'll be really impressed if the Demoness card also uses his image. As Klein lampooned, he read through the corresponding contents, analyzing the sequence names, ingredients, and rituals of the storm pathway. Sequence 9, Sailor. Sequence 8, Folk of Rage. Sequence 7, Seafarer. Sequence 6, Wind Blessed. Sequence 5, Ocean Songster. Sequence 4, Cataclysmic Interrer. Sequence 3, Sea King. Sequence 2, Calamity. Sequence 1, Thunder God. Sequence 0, Tyrant. The ritual to become Tyrant, or in other words, the Lord of Storms, is very different from that of the Black Emperor. Firstly, it needs hundreds of thousands of followers to submit and believe in said person out of fear. Secondly, it is to challenge a true deity, in other words, another Sequence 0, and survive. Finally, in this atmosphere of fear and submission, consume the potion to complete the advancement. This sucks. A Sequence 1 who hasn't experienced a qualitative change is to challenge a Sequence 0 true deity. Doesn't that spell almost certain death? Besides, what if there's no Sequence 0 during that era? Then, wouldn't one need to think of a way to nurture one, or to switch to a neighboring pathway? Of course, the ritual might not be necessary. With enough luck, there's still a chance of succeeding by directly drinking the potion. Sea God Calvetua was such an example. It didn't even consume a potion but instead an unconcocted Beyonder characteristic. The core of this ritual is the courage to challenge a deity, with massive feelings of fear and submission. Tyrant doesn't seem to come equipped with the Black Emperor's uniqueness of distorting rules, preventing him from resurrecting from the dead and returning from the void. However, it seems to be able to transform into lightning or light for a short period of time, perhaps capable of creating a planet-level disaster. Emperor Roselle's focus is on the formula and ritual. His description of the Beyonder powers and deity authorities are very vague. Klein casually summoned a piece of paper that wasn't conjured. Using a fountain pen, he recorded the cataclysmic interr's potion formula and wrote a note in the World Gehrman Sparrow's style of speech. Avoid recalling the contents of that picture usually. This was a warning for the hanged man. In the mysterious domain, matters that involved sequence 0 required caution and carefulness. Care needed to be taken even if it violated common sense. It didn't mean that seeing and discussing that picture on the primitive island meant that they were safe in the outside world. If they often recalled the matter, there might be a day when they were lucky enough to have lightning smite down at them suffering from an unresolvable conundrum that killed them with an aneurysm, or them dying from heatstroke from the sun's radiance. The ritual of the cataclysmic interrer is extremely dangerous. It will trigger earthquakes and tsunamis, and the advancer needs to consume the potion in such an environment, holding out until it ends. Klein folded the piece of paper and placed it to the side while putting away the tyrant card. After using divination to confirm that the 3 Beyonder characteristics he obtained were separately the Black Emperor Pathways Sequence 5 Mentor of Confusion, Storm Pathways Sequence 5 Ocean Songster, and Planter Pathways Sequence 5 Druid, Klein finally had the time to recall what had happened during his exploration as he considered the information it hid. Eternal Blazing Sun is clearly of the Sun Pathway, and that City of Silver Creator is also known as the Ancient Sun God. This can be determined from some of the 4th epic history and the murals of the elves. According to the law of sequence Beyonder characteristics conservation of having no sequence 1 when there's a sequence 0, the white angel back then likely wasn't a king of angels. But if he wasn't a king of angels, he had no right to partake in the feast of the City of Silver Creator. This not only has external elements in play, but it also includes the problem of jumping directly from sequence 2 to sequence 0, which has a high chance of losing control. Either Eternal Blazing Sun had switched pathways to become a god, or the City of Silver Creator's main authority wasn't the sun. After he defeated the ancient gods, he had already allocated parts of his authority to the angels beside him, making them become kings of angels. Therefore, the elves' murals and the name that eventually spread had only indicated that he once wielded authority over the sun, and that it wasn't an authority he held the entire time. There's also another possibility. The Creator, who took over the ancient gods' authorities, had the ability to allow a sequence 2 of the same pathway to advance to sequence 1. Klein's train of thought quickly turned to who had built the cathedral and left behind the mural. Due to the messiness of the various situations, he conjured a piece of goatskin, and he summarized all the points by writing them down to seek out the connection. That primitive island was discovered by Kalangos and Mr. Hanged Man. Kalangos received a mission from the Twilight Hermit Order. To obtain a priceless item, he headed to Backland to assassinate Duke Negan, and he ended up dying at Mr. Azek's hands. Kalangos told Mr. Hanged Man that deep inside the ruin was a precious item that was in no way worse than Roselle's tarot card, but it was something that could only be obtained at sequence 5. He later obtained Creeping Hunger and became a pirate admiral, with a strength already equivalent to a sequence 5. That tyrant card remains deep inside the cathedral's catacombs. Kalangos didn't make any subsequent attempts. Or did his attempts fail? That cathedral was built by an existence who worships the ancient sun god. The mural depicts the dark history of the true deities before the cataclysm, and is clearly on the ancient sun god's side. The Twilight Hermit Order is suspected to be established by the Son of God, Adam, with the goal of resurrecting the ancient sun god, the City of Silver Creator. That primitive island suddenly disappeared as though it never existed. Adam is an angel of imagination. Amongst the Twilight Hermit Order's core members, there's at least one angel of the spectator pathway, Hermes. The Twilight Hermit Order tends to select members of the Sailor, Reader, or Sun pathways. It has a high chance of possessing high-sequence ingredients and items from the Storm Domain. There might be angels from the Storm Domain in it. Klein lowered his pen and looked at the content listed out as he slowly made a guess. Chapter 8:16. Completing the transaction. After listing down all the important points, Klein rapped the edge of the long model table and silently muttered, "The one who sighed in the depths of the cathedral is a member of the Twilight Hermit Order?" Kalangos had caught the eye of the Twilight Hermit Order after he managed to venture deep inside. Later, he obtained an advancement and received Creeping Hunger, allowing him to become a pirate admiral. If that's the case, it can be understood why he didn't go to the primitive island again to take away the tyrant card after possessing the strength of a sequence 5. It's yours only if it's given. You can't touch it if it's not given. Of course, Kalengos might have established contact with that member of the Twilight Hermit Order during his second visit of the cathedral after possessing enough combat strength. Regardless, that primitive island must have quite a connection with the Twilight Hermit Order. The reason why we arrived at the tomb rather smoothly in the other zones and saw the picture of the kings of angels feasting on the Creator was because that Twilight Hermit Order member had the intention of letting us do so. They are happy to let that lost piece of history spread given the chance. However, their depiction of something from their own standpoints might not be the truth as well. Later, that Twilight Hermit Order member probably sighed because he or she didn't expect us to quickly finish off the awakened deceased bodies and the 6-winged gargoyle to obtain the tyrant card. With how things normally go, we should have been in danger, and he quells everything, talking to us from a distance, making us outer circle members of the Twilight Hermit Order. Klein carefully used he to refer to the existence in the depths of the abandoned cathedral. He even suspected that the person might be the former king of angels, son of God, Adam. Of course, he wasn't certain if the primitive island belonged to the Twilight Hermit Order. He believed that even divination wouldn't give him a certain answer, as there were too many possibilities. It also involved other hidden existences, and any information related to the spirit world would definitely be wiped away or hidden. If it's really as I guessed, does that mean that I missed the chance of joining the Twilight Hermit Order? If I passed their test, then I might be able to take a glance at the second blasphemy slate and obtain the high-sequence potion formulas of the seer pathway. What a pity. However, Gehrman Sparrow has a mysterious origin with a secret existence backing him. This is known by the various factions at sea, and as the most ancient and secret organization, the Twilight Hermit Order will definitely be aware of the corresponding situation. The outcome for Gehrman Sparrow would probably be immediate execution and then having answers obtained via spirit channeling. Klein first found it a pity before feeling afraid. As his thoughts whirred, he even thought of sending the hanged man to the primitive island again and seek out an opportunity to make him an outer circle member of the Twilight Hermit Order, so that he could slowly reach its core. Sigh, but the problem is that the primitive island has vanished. Otherwise, Mr. Hanged Man really has a chance of being a quadruple spy. Klein snapped his fingers and made the paper in front of him disappear, throwing the night's exploration to the back of his mind. However, he warned himself that he needed to pay attention to the appearances of any abnormalities in his daily life. He was afraid that it wasn't that the hidden existence deep in the cathedral wasn't able to stop himself and the hanged man from escaping, but that he had a deeper motive. If not for the gray fog in him having been sterilized, Klein even suspected if there were any hidden marks left on him. Glancing at the items on the table, Klein first flipped the tyrant card over and placed it beside the Black Emperor card. Following that, he began considering how he would deal with the remaining spoils of war. He already had plans for the sequence 5 Druid Beyonder characteristic of the planter pathway, sell it to Frank Lee via the Hermit Catlia. But the problem is whether I want to accelerate the destruction of this world. Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh as he fell into a dilemma. Allowing a dangerous fellow like Frank Lee to advance to sequence 5 meant that cows, fish, the sea, and rose bishops would be fearful. No one knew what this fellow, who was no better than a lunatic, would achieve in his experiments after obtaining greater powers. It was an unknown what sort of strange species he could create. What if he plants himself and obtains a bunch of Franks? The world would truly be in danger if that happens. Klein silently exhaled and planned on letting Admiral of Stars vex over this problem. After all, I'll just be selling the Druid Beyonder characteristic normally. Whether Ma'am Hermit wishes to buy it is up to her. Besides, it's only a sequence 5. I believe Queen Mystic and the Moses Ascetic Order will support her and be able to ensure nothing goes wrong. Besides, the Church of Mother Earth has a bunch of saints, angels, and grade 0 sealed artifacts, as well as a true deity. There's nothing they can't handle. As Klein consoled himself, he placed his attention onto the Mentor of Confusion and Ocean Songster Beyonder characteristics. His initial plan for the latter was to create a mystical item, but he wasn't sure if the artisan that the hanged man knew had the ability to do so. As for the former, he planned on selling it. Although it could also be made into an item, it overlapped with the Baron of Corruption inside the glove. Besides, Klein also began to realize that having too many mystical items wasn't necessarily a good thing. Particular negative effects were a pain when stacked. With creeping hunger and the rentable Laymanos travels, he believed that it was best if he traveled light most of the time. Under normal circumstances, creeping hunger matched with death knell, along with a few purifying bullets, it was enough to deal with most matters. When in a sea or air battle, he could have an additional mystical item made from an ocean songster. In complicated situations, he could rent Laymanos travels when given the opportunity. If there wasn't an opportunity, he could use Grozel's travels for defense, and throw out the Fate Siphon charm. And this wasn't considering his own Beyonder powers, Wraith Marionette, or the hard-to-use Sea God Scepter. In terms of fixed assets, I'm considered a true tycoon. Klein sighed as he made the Beyonder characteristics fly to the junk pile. As for the eyeball of the six-winged gargoyle, this was a material rich in spirituality and had some hint of strangeness. It could be used in a ritual to create charms. Klein temporarily had no better use or requirements for it, so he had already thrown it into the junk pile. After doing all of this, he disappeared from above the gray fog, and he returned to the real world. On Saturday morning, Furs had originally planned on waking up naturally, but she ended up being awoken by the world's transmission via Mr. Fool. He was returning Laymanos travels to her. Furs rubbed her eyes and planned on directly preparing the ritual, but when she saw her messy hair and puffy eyes, she decided to wash up first to make herself look human. She had finally sold the 2 properties yesterday, selling them at a higher price than she had expected. Even after deducting the corresponding taxes, she had received £6,550. To her chagrin, gold coins which were used in daily life may appear common, but when she attempted to collect them en masse, she failed to obtain much. After plenty of work, all she got was 600 gold coins. Phew, I can finally repay the debt and complete the transaction. Furs combed her hair and began setting up the ritual. Last night, to celebrate her first time accumulating such immense wealth, she secretly drank half a bottle of Lanty and a barrel of Southville beer. This resulted in her waking up in a terrible state. During the ritual, and after some communication, Furs paid £5,200 and 600 gold coins, closing the assassination commission and receiving an interrogator Beyonder characteristic. This way, she still had £2,530 in cash. As for the royalties from her 2 books, although they weren't much, they were relatively stable. After a brief wait, Furs saw the door of sacrifice and bestowment light up as 2 items flew out. One of them was Laymanos Travels, and the other was a light blue, translucent hexagonal prism. In it were streaking bolts of lightning. Mr. World sure has many Beyonder characteristics on hand. Furs sighed silently and first thanked Mr. Fool before ending the ritual to accept the interrogator's Beyonder characteristic. Finally, she picked up Laymanos Travels and flipped through it to see what additional Beyonder powers there were. As the pages flipped over, her gaze suddenly froze. This was because 2 of the charred yellow pages weren't empty. They were filled with mysterious and strange patterns and symbols. These represented Beyonder powers at the demigod level. A total of 2 pages. How extravagant, Furs couldn't help herself as she muttered. This was the first time she was seeing a demigod Beyonder power which she could freely use. As a best-selling author who mainly wrote romance, her first reaction was that the world Gehrman Sparrow was chasing after her. But thinking back to how they hadn't met before, and how the gentleman was a cold and powerful assassin, she quickly rejected such a guess. She believed that the world Gehrman Sparrow was probably able to receive help from a demigod at any time, so he didn't mind such matters. Phew, I should try not to use it. I'll let Mr. World use it when he rents it again. Furs exhaled with some fear, completely lacking the guts to take advantage of the terrifying assassin. After composing herself, she used her crystal ball and identified all the new Beyonder powers. She felt that they were all relatively useful apart from Full Moon. If I wish to commit suicide, this is quite a useful one, she muttered and closed Lamino's travels. She planned on giving Zio the interrogator's beyonder characteristic when she returned in the evening. At 7 in the evening, Klein wore starched clothes as he waited at the foyer with butler Walter and valet Richardson to welcome the guests at his ball. Soon, he saw a familiar face walk over. Aaron Series. This famous surgeon walked to the main door while helping his pregnant wife. Pregnant lady. Klein's heart stirred as he walked over with a beaming smile. Chapter 8:17. Guests. As a polite gentleman, Klein obviously wouldn't stare at Aaron's wife. He looked at the famous surgeon and said, "Good evening, Aaron. How may I address your lovely companion?" Aaron's cold demeanor hadn't changed, but it didn't stop him from handing over an intricately packed bottle of red wine and say with a polite smile, "My wife, Wilma Gladys, a middle school teacher. It appears you are about to become a father again. When's it due?" Klein received the present and asked. The topic he had planned to cover when talking to Dr. Aaron had been about a few new surgery techniques in the papers, but he never expected him to bring his pregnant wife. This was a pleasant surprise for him. This was because Ma'am Wilma Gladys was expecting the unborn snake of Mercury, Willa Septon. Aaron subconsciously glanced at his wife's tummy and said with a smile, "Early July. If you don't mind, I wish to invite you to his birth party." Just as he said that, the gentle and beautiful black-haired lady, Wilma, suddenly held her tummy and exclaimed in pain. "What happened?" Aaron asked in concern. "He kicked me, but he's calmed down," Wilma said with an eased expression. She then looked at Dwayne Dantes and smiled. "Because of my pregnancy, I've been home all the time and haven't been to such balls in a while. Feeling pent up at home, I got Aaron to bring me along. Although I can't dance, I'll be able to chat with the other ladies, and I'll even find some time to play some cards." "Your presence honors me," Klein sincerely replied. "I will come for his birth party in early July." He wasn't affected by the tiny accident, as he still remembered Dr. Aaron's invitation. After exchanging a few words of pleasantries, Klein handed over the gift to his valet, Richardson, and got him to lead his 3 guests into the hall. Without needing to wait too long, he received his second guest. It was Bishop Electra, who was still wearing his black clergyman robe, and his female partner. His partner was a lady in her early 20s who still had a little bit of baby fat to her cheeks. She looked at everything with a sense of wonder, and she was filled with energy. However, she had an additional hint of maturity to her due to her already having a child. "Good evening, Your Excellency. My sleep has recently been excellent," Klein said, feigning ignorance of the Church of Evernight's secret efforts. Electra immediately tapped his chest 4 times in a clockwise fashion. "This is a blessing of the goddess." He then introduced his female partner. "She's my wife, Shona Johnson." As he often visited Dwayne Dantes and had been to his residence several times, he didn't need to prepare any gifts for the ball. It would appear overly polite and too distant. "Nice to meet you. You are a lot younger than I imagined," Klein greeted Shona half politely and half jokingly with a nod. Meanwhile, he silently did the math. It said that the bishop got married 2 years ago. That means that his wife was only 18 or 19. This age difference is quite huge. In a few years, I might have to introduce a particular chubby apothecary to him. Upon hearing Dwayne Dantes's joke, and recalling the conversation back when he visited him while the former was sick, Electra immediately felt uneasy. He coughed gently and replied, "She's someone who likes a bustle. If she's free, she has no wish to miss any ball." Klein didn't speak further because he saw Ma'am Mary alight from her carriage and was walking over. After letting Bishop Electra and his wife enter the hall, Klein smiled at Mary and said, "Ma'am, perhaps we will be fellow workers next week." The lawyer and accounting team he hired had completed their investigations and had cleared the Coim Company's audit and said that it was very suitable for investing into. Furthermore, he had already reached a preliminary agreement with the gentleman who was selling the shares. Final confirmation of the sale of 3% shares for £12,800 was to be made next week. When Mary heard that, she chuckled and said, I already treat you as a partner. This seems to have a deeper meaning to it. Don't tell me that Dwayne Dantes has caught your fancy. Klein's heart stirred as he feigned ignorance and reached his hand out. I hope for a pleasant partnership. After a shake of hands, he got butler Walter to lead the lady in. At this moment, more and more guests were arriving. Klein recalled the corresponding topics and warmly and humorously received them, receiving plenty of gifts as a result. If not for my instinctive ability as a faceless to remember a person's looks and characteristics, I wouldn't be able to tell who is who, much less find the correct topic to raise. It's no wonder that a butler's help is often needed at such times. As Klein was stirring in poignancy, he saw Member of Parliament Mocked and his family arrive. He smiled again and took a step forward. Good evening. Today's starry sky is especially beautiful. Member of Parliament Mocked smiled as he handed a bottle of Black Rand from some unknown vineyard to him and said, I've been in Backlund for nearly 20 years, but the number of starry skies I've seen combined cannot even compare to the number I've seen this year. I hope there will be more with time. Klein then said to Ma'am Rihanna, I heard that the both of you have gotten a boarding school for Miss Hazel. Rihanna looked at her daughter, who wore a cold expression despite maintaining a polite smile. Boarding school education is becoming increasingly popular. It's the same for females. And most importantly, perhaps Hazel will get to know more friends. Unfortunately, she doesn't seem too happy about this arrangement, as she can't bear to leave us. In Backlund, boarding schools that targeted females of high society had already grown in popularity. The education they provided might not be better than home tutors, but it created a social circle. The school fees for such a boarding school like that was about £500 a year. She probably can't bear to part with the sewers here. Klein lampooned. After a short chat, he let Member of Parliament Mocked and family into the hall. When it was almost time, he didn't wait by the door and instead walked to the second floor. Standing behind the railing that faced the main door, he gestured for the musicians to pause the music. Holding a cup of champagne, Klein surveyed the surroundings. With all the guests looking at him, he loudly said, I'm very happy that all of you can grace this ball with your presence. First, I'd like to thank the goddess, as well as you. I've prepared for everyone local music and food from Desi, and I hope you will like it. After a simple speech, Klein walked down the stairs to the first floor, in preparation to invite a lady to dance the opening dance. Typically, a married host would definitely invite his own partner for the opening dance, while unmarried men or women would dance with a relative of the opposite sex, or invite someone they had their eye on, in an alternate form of a blind date. But Dwayne Dantes didn't have any family or any suitable target, so this matter appeared somewhat embarrassing. However, he had an experienced butler. His butler had hired a socialite of high society, and although dancing the opening dance would result in some rumors, it wouldn't make others believe that they were dating. Therefore, Klein looked at the lady named Aurea without any guilt as he walked towards her. This lady was a widow who had good relationships with several people in Backlund's high society. She enjoyed quite a status in this circle, but of course, she wasn't well liked by the ladies. Anyone with a bit of standing looked down on her. Regardless, Aurea's female charms and her bearing was excellent. It was especially so with her figure that had alluring curves. If it wasn't because her looks were only above average, Klein would have suspected that she was a demoness. Ma'am, may I have the pleasure of dancing with you? Klein followed the teachings of his etiquette teacher, Wiana, and posed flawlessly. Aurea with her blonde hair bun smiled and reached out her hand. You are a gentleman that cannot be rejected. That sounds ambiguous. Her identity and the role she plays in social settings ensures that she can't act as demure as most ladies and madams. Klein held her hand, entered the dance floor, and began dancing under the tune of a village folk song. The aristocrats all had land, manors, and castles in the villages, and they spent several months a year there. Therefore, folk songs were one of the mainstream songs in high society social events. You dance really well. If Wiana hadn't mentioned it before, I wouldn't believe that you weren't able to dance before. Aurea deliberately leaned in close. As they moved in step, her breathing could be heard. As she was a stranger, Klein was a little uneasy by the close distance, but he couldn't push her away while under everyone's gaze, so all he could do was smile. I just didn't know how to dance such dances. In fact, I'm good at the kind of dances from Desi Bay and the southern continent where there's greater freedom. I also like those kinds of dances. They are full of strength and passion. It's danced for yourself and not for others. Aurea found a topic as she gyrated her body, appearing extremely intimate with Dwayne Dantes. Towards the end of the opening dance, she said with a suppressed chuckle, "If it wasn't for the rumors, I would even suspect that you don't fancy women because you're a little stiff. However, I no longer have any doubts." As she spoke, she glanced down. Klein was actually rather embarrassed. She was really good at using her body and words to create a suggestive atmosphere. However, Dwayne Dantes was an experienced man and couldn't admit defeat. He smiled with a natural expression. Stiffness is a result of not being used to Backlund's social scene. "I can teach you," Aurea said with a chuckle. At that moment, the tune came to an end as she took a step back and winked with a smile. "You're really passionate." The words were a double entendre that left Klein nearly blushing. He even began to suspect if she was related to demonesses. He continued wearing a stoic expression as he bent his back into a bow, and he sent Aurea back to her spot. Through the corner of his eye, he caught Wilma Gladys, who was pregnant with the snake of Mercury, walking towards the long table to the side. Her target was apparently the first batch of ice cream. Chapter 8:18. Warning. Klein's gaze moved away from Wilma Gladys and looked to the pastries like carrot cake and cream puffs to the side, as well as the roasted poussin, stewed lamb, seared ribeye, Desi roasted fish, and the other food nearby. He gulped his saliva slightly and forced himself to retract his gaze as he prepared to invite Ma'am Mary for the second dance. As the host, he couldn't skip any of the first 3 dances, therefore, all he could do was temporarily forget his hunger and the delicacies. And at this moment, Wilma Gladys, whose pregnant state showed, walked to the spot where there was ice cream. She reached out her hand before retracting it. "You want some?" Dr. Aaron hadn't joined the first dance as he stayed by his pregnant wife's side. Wilma Gladys sternly shook her head. "No, I don't. I'm pregnant. It's not good to have ice cream. However, the little fella in my tummy seems to want a little, just a little." Dr. Aaron nodded indiscernibly and said, "Then have some. Leave the rest to me." Wilma immediately revealed an irresistible smile. "You spoil him too much." She didn't object to it as she watched her husband pick up a scoop of ice cream that had been circled with ice. After taking 2 bites, Wilma closed her eyes and suddenly shifted her gaze. She looked at a few ladies who hadn't participated in the first dance. They were chatting about something in hushed tones. They had smiles across their suggestive faces, often covering their mouths and laughing covertly. What interesting matters are they talking about? Wilma's curiosity was instantly piqued, and after informing her husband, Aaron, she walked over. However, the few ladies quickly dispersed as though they were awaiting the second dance. Wilma was disappointed as she asked the young beautiful lady who remained standing there, "Do you know what they were discussing about?" "I'm not interested in their topics," Hazel said as she glanced at the pregnant lady beside her. She didn't fault her for being a little impolite because pregnant ladies often had some privileges. Only then did Wilma notice that Hazel, with her long black-green hair, was holding a cup of champagne. She looked like she had no wish to be invited to a dance. She has a sense of pride that stems from the bottom of her heart. Even when looking at Baronet Madams, she will only maintain the most basic courtesy. This is a delightful character, but the problem is that she's like that to everyone. She's overly cold and aloof. Perhaps, she's in the rebellious stage that Emperor Roselle had mentioned before? As a middle school teacher, Wilma couldn't help but make comment inwardly. Then, knowing better, she opened up a distance from Hazel and began looking for the ladies she was familiar with. After completing 3 dances, Klein finally had a brief reprieve to stuff himself with more food and drink some thirst-quenching sweet iced tea. This was a D's specialty that he specially got the kitchen to prepare. Due to the influence of Death Knell, he had drank a little too much. After having a short conversation with Bishop Electra, he had to apologize and take his leave to the washroom. In fact, he could hold back for another 3 more dances. However, he felt that Snake of Fate Wuxia Septon might have wanted to communicate with him, judging from his sudden appearance. Therefore, he found a suitable place without anyone around. Although he is an unborn fetus and came here passively, if he doesn't wish to meet me, he has 100 ways to stop his mother from heading out. In short, it's worth giving it a try. Klein mumbled as he entered the washroom and locked the door. Just as he was in a dilemma to deal with his burgeoning bladder or patiently wait another 2 minutes, his spiritual perception triggered as he looked at the mirror. At some point in time, the mirror had produced a black pram that was covered in shadows that prevented him from seeing any details. The only thing he could discern was that there was a child wrapped in silver silk inside. The child used a clear voice and said, "Your fate deviated a little." What happened? Klein tensed up immediately. Wuxia Septon in his infant form scoffed and said, "You should ask yourself. All I know is that you likely met an angel." Klein immediately recalled his experiences on the primitive island and had a guess. After contemplating for a few seconds, he asked with a frown, "Can angels see my uniqueness?" "I've met Orange Light, and he said that only a few high-level creatures of the spirit world, as well as deities with certain unique authorities or beyonder who represent fate can discover this point to a certain extent. Of course, close contact has to be made." In the pram, Wuxia Septon sucked at his thumb and laughed. "Probably not, because you aren't dangerous. Besides, apart from you being unique, some items on you or your companion might have a similar uniqueness that can garner the interest of that person." Items on me, my companions. Klein's mind raced as he discovered that he might have been psychologically cued in the past, and along with the fact that he hadn't thought of it, he had missed out something. When exploring the primitive island, he had brought Grozel's travels along. This was a book created by an ancient god, the Dragon of Imagination, Ankwelt. If that primitive island is related to the Twilight Hermit Order, be it the Angel of the Spectator pathway deep inside the cathedral with a high-sequence ingredient of the Storm pathway, or the opposite, he will likely be interested in the notebook. After all, the leader of the organization is the Angel of Imagination, the son of God, Adam. And it's because of this notebook that I was allowed to take away the tyrant card while also preventing me and Mr. Hanged Man from continuing the exploration? Klein had a hunch as he asked, "How should I resolve this?" "There's no need. In the long term, this should be something good, but there might be some trouble midway," Wuxia Septon replied with a clear voice. "Furthermore, you are already burdened with so many matters. An additional matter wouldn't matter. I warned you so that you can take note so as to not be struck by trouble, makes sense. One stops worrying when there are too many debts. Perhaps it might create opportunities and let my debtors end up fighting." On careful thought, Klein echoed inwardly. He asked instead, "My friend who wishes to obtain a drop of a mythical creature's blood wishes to know exactly what you need." "What do I need?" Wuxia Septon scoffed once again. "There's plenty I need. For example, the means to accommodate the die of probability, or how to finish off Ouroboros. If it's possible, you can take as many vials of blood as you want. But, can it be done? If it's possible, why take the risk to finish off Ouroboros? Wouldn't it be easier to just deal with a weak snake of fate like you?" As Klein lampooned, he shook his head without a doubt. "No. Then think of something else. I'm not in a rush." Wuxia Septon paused and said, "There's a very arrogant lady at the ball tonight. There's something wrong with her. If you have the chance to chat with her, you can lead the topic of conversation towards dreams." "Hazel? Dreams?" Klein nodded in thought. "Okay." Seeing that Wuxia Septon had the intention to leave, he hurriedly said, "That paper crane is about to tear. How should I contact you in the future when I encounter an emergency?" Wuxia Septon fell silent for a moment before saying, "Are you hoping that I can fold a paper crane for you in my mother's tummy? Even if I can, you won't be able to get it. If I have any desire to find you, and as long as you live here, I can do so at any time during dreams. If you have any emergency matters, just visit my father directly. After all, don't you have to wait when using the paper crane? Alright, as a fetus who hasn't been born, I need to have more sleep. Let's leave anything else to the future. All Klein could do was nod and say, if there's nothing else from you. Just as Wuxia was about to dissipate his body, he suddenly paused for 2 seconds and said, another thing. What is it? Klein tensed up once again. Wuxia dragged out his tone and said, the ice cream your cook made is too sweet, ah? Klein temporarily didn't react to what he was saying until the black pram vanished from the mirror. He then snapped out of his daze and couldn't help but twitch the corners of his lips. After settling the problem with his burgeoning bladder, he washed his hands and came out. He found Richardson and instructed, go to the kitchen and get them to lower the sweetness of the ice cream that is subsequently being made. Richardson didn't ask why, and he immediately did as he was told. Only when he was about to enter the kitchen did he recall the problem. Mr. Dwayne Dantes hasn't touched the ice cream yet, so how did he know that it's a little too sweet? Towards this problem, Richardson quickly had an answer. He believed that a guest had informed his employer after sampling the ice cream. Although it was a little impolite, it wasn't something rare, especially among familiar friends. They would proactively and kindly inform him so as to prevent the host of the ball from suffering unpleasant critique. At this moment, as the previous dance was still happening, Klein wasn't in a hurry to consider a dance partner. He walked to the long table by the side and seized the opportunity to have some of the delicacies. Just as he selected a piece of Desi roasted fish without many bones, he suddenly saw Wilma Gladys lean over and pick up a cup of sweet iced tea. The lady nodded at the host and smiled. This beverage is nice. I've never had it before. It's sweet iced tea from the south, Klein explained with a smile as he casually glanced at her tummy. He seems to be very obedient. Oh, perhaps, it's a she. Wilma smiled. Most of the time, but there might be some stirrings in the middle of the night at times. Middle of the night. At times. Don't tell me it's when he's replying to my questions. Klein suddenly broke out into a sweat as he feigned ignorance and cast his attention back onto his plate. As Wilma drank a sip of sweet iced tea, she headed back to her previous conversation. When the new dance began, Klein handed his plate and cup to an attendant beside him and glanced at Hazel. He slowly walked over and bowed with a smile. Lady, may I have the pleasure of dancing with you? Hazel fell silent for a few seconds and placed the cup of champagne onto an attendant's tray and replied politely, it will be my pleasure. Chapter 8:19 Gift. Amidst a soothing melody, Klein and Hazel began dancing with their backs straight. One was tall and slim, and apart from the clear difference in age, their movements, demeanor, and looks were highly compatible. It was a beautiful sight to behold, one that could almost be used as a prime example for dancing. Klein took the initiative to break the silence. As they twirled, he casually said, I often had nightmares some time ago, but thankfully I had the goddess's blessings. I prayed a few times at the cathedral and drank a few cups of holy water, and after that, I stopped jolting awake. Hazel silently looked up and, after 2 seconds, asked, what kind of nightmare? To think you will be interested in such a topic. Wuxia was right after all. Klein replied with a smile, I was being pursued by all kinds of monsters inside an abandoned, dilapidated cathedral. But you probably know, it's almost impossible to remember the details in a dream. I find it difficult to describe those monsters. Hazel didn't say a word, but her bright, brown eyes were colored with dissent. That also meant that she believed that dreams weren't necessarily impossible to recall. Klein took a step diagonally with her in his arms as he said with a smile, indeed, I've had a very clear dream in the past. Back then, I was still in the southern continent. I dreamed of an inverted mausoleum. It was constructed from pitch-black stone columns that extended underground. There were zombies covered in white feathers that appeared from them in a bid to pull me in. I had such dreams for several days, and it's really quite embarrassing. I was very afraid back then, so I frantically went to a nearby city and found a divination club. I got them to interpret my dream, and I received the conclusion that during one of my purchases of local goods, I had offended the faith of a tribe that believed in death. Strangely, when I went to the tribe to apologize, gave them gifts, and participated in their celebrations, I never had that dream again. He had fabricated the story from his experience as a seer. His goal was to pique Hazel's interest to see if she would unknowingly reveal something. At the same time, this was a suggestion with a deeper meaning, one that wouldn't garner suspicion. The deeper meaning was that Hazel could find a divination club member or a cathedral's priest to interpret her dream if she was troubled by it. It was best not to make rash choices while blindly believing the contents of the dream. When Wuxia mentioned that there was something wrong with Hazel and suggested chatting about dreams, Klein suspected that her dilemma stemmed from a dream that kept happening. Otherwise, it was hard to explain how, despite being at least a sequence 8, she had a severe lack of knowledge towards the mysterious world with her blind arrogance. Furthermore, she was a lady from high society who had been educated at home. Thus, it made it difficult for her to make contact with unaffiliated Beyonders or those without clear intentions. After all, her father was a member of parliament who was definitely protected. She likely had no lack of Beyonders around her. Therefore, Klein believed that Hazel might have made contact with something or had caught the fancy of some powerful Beyonder due to her personality. Through dreams, she was slowly guided to become a Beyonder, without giving her the necessary knowledge. At the same time, the entity enticed her to dig in the sewers to search for something. There were two reasons that solidified his theory. Firstly, it was because of Wuxia's words. Secondly, Sequence 5 of the Marauder pathway was Dream Stealer. It was impossible that it only had the one Beyonder power of stealing the intent behind an action. Hazel quietly listened to Dwayne Dantes' description as her mouth subconsciously gaped before closing again. After nearly 10 seconds, she asked, "Why didn't you head to the goddess's cathedral?" As expected, she's reacting to topics about dreams. However, she's quite careful and doesn't divulge anything. Klein smiled wryly and said, there weren't any cathedrals of the goddess around. It was a region that held faith in the god of steam and machinery. Hazel didn't continue the topic as she focused her attention back onto the dance, as though she was fully immersed in the music. Klein also quietened down as he swirled around in the beautiful melody with the girl. After the dance, he sent Hazel back to where she was standing, and then he headed for the long table due to his thirst, hoping to get a cup of sweet iced tea. At this moment, he saw Bishop Electra enjoying some red wine over there. Unlike the Church of Storms and the Church of the God of Combat, clergymen of the Evernight Goddess were prohibited from excessive drinking. They needed to reject distilled spirits, and they could only drink champagne, beer, and red and white grape wine in moderation. How is it? This should be your first time holding such a grand ball, right? Electra smiled as he raised his cup. Klein smiled and replied, very troublesome, and it's also, The biggest problem is that having so many dances in a row is exhausting. I kept sweating and wanted to drink more water. Bishop Electra chuckled and said, when you're here in Backlund, don't slack on any physical exercise. At times, the social scene is more tiring than you can imagine. With that said, he said with a jibing smile, Ma'am Aurea has endorsed you, believing that your character matches your appearance. I'd like to thank her for her endorsement. Klein was momentarily unable to find the words to reply with as he replied in a jokingly manner, a person's character cannot be identified from a single dance. Without waiting for Electra to reveal a smile that all men understood, he switched to saying, Your Excellency, I've recently involved myself in some business, and I'm afraid that I might offend a gentleman in power. I'm a little worried. He was referring to the coin company and Baron Sindras. Electra took a sip of red wine and said, Don't worry. Backlund follows the rule of law. Besides, the goddess will bless you. That's relieving. Praise the lady. Klein seriously drew the crimson moon on his chest. After Electra headed for the dance floor, his gaze darkened as he sighed silently. He wasn't feeling fearful or hatred. He just felt a slight guilty conscience. Up to this point in time, the Church of Evernight had been good to him. Although money was the reason, they had provided him plenty of help to the point of providing him some protection. Yet, he was planning to deal with the keepers, as well as contemplating how to steal something from the core seal behind Cheney's gate. Sigh, if this plan takes too long to complete, I'd really need periodic psychological treatment. Otherwise, I'll have some mental problems. Klein monitored his emotions as he shook his head indiscernibly. In an apartment in Sherwood Borough, Zio came home with Fainapotter pies and Desi Bay sweet iced tea. As she put it on the dining table, she said to Furs, "Don't eat too much of such food. It's unhealthy." "Why do you say that?" Furs picked up a pie stuffed with fruits and ham before taking a bite. "I read about it in a magazine. As a bounty hunter, maintaining one's figure is a necessity." Zio hesitated for a moment before pulling a pie to her mouth. Furs scoffed. "You're a Beyonder geared for combat, an extraordinary bounty hunter. There's no need to bother about maintaining your figure. Perhaps, you might have missed out on your final opportunity to grow taller as a result." "Oh right, I heard that the warrior pathway has an effective way of raising a person's height. It's obvious just from looking at those barbarians from Faisak." Zio was taken aback as she suddenly sighed. "But I was born as a half-arbiter. I have no way of becoming a warrior." Clearly, she had seriously considered it in the past. Realizing that she had triggered her friend's memories, she acted as though she hadn't said a word as she focused on having her late dinner. After they were done eating and clearing up, Furs pulled Zio into her bedroom and cleared her throat. "You've helped me tremendously, so I plan on giving you a present. What troublesome matter do you need help with this time?" Zio touched her short, blonde hair warily. Furs blinked as she suddenly reflected on her recent behavior. She chuckled dryly and said, "This is for the past, the past." Without waiting for Zio to reply, she took out a metal box under Zio's doubtful gaze, one that was used to store cigars. "I don't smoke," Zio said with a shake of her head. Furs tersely answered as she opened the box, revealing a translucent hexagonal pillar that was light blue in color. Zio's gaze froze as she looked at the luster that streaked inside the crystal-like lightning as she instinctively asked, "Interrogator?" Yes, a participant at a Beyonder gathering was selling it cheaply. "I was afraid of missing the opportunity and hurriedly bought it," Furs said the complete truth. "As you know, I've recently been rewarded by my teacher because of something just a while ago. I'm not lacking in cash." Zio knew that her friend had been out recently, claiming that she was doing something for her teacher. However, she found it unbelievable that she could so easily buy her an interrogator Beyonder characteristic as a gift. This was completely unlike her original lifestyle. Is she still gambling, having earned large sums of money after becoming an astrologer? Or did she finally cast her sights onto a bank vault and use her door-opening powers to rob the cash inside? Many guesses flashed through Zio's mind, but she wasn't able to find the corresponding proof. About 2 to 3 seconds later, she made a decision. She was to randomly pretend to head out 2 days a week, and she would secretly observe what Furs was doing. If it wasn't for her trust in her friend's character and bottom line, she would have suspected that she had become the mistress of a powerful Beyonder or tycoon. It's too valuable." Zio waved her hand, in an attempt to reject the gift. Furs had already thought of the excuse as she said with a smile, "I'll have matters to trouble you with in the future. Just treat it as an advanced payment. We are good friends." "There's no need to talk about payment," Zio hesitated for a second as she said with a shake of her head. "I was waiting for you to say that." Furs immediately smiled and said, "Then treat it as an early birthday present. Don't you reject it." "But my birthday is more than half a year away," as Zio muttered. She eventually reached out and took the interrogator Beyonder characteristic. Sunday afternoon. Zio repressed her excitement and anticipation as she headed out as per normal. She planned on heading to a specific spot to leave a corresponding mark to schedule a meeting with the masked man from MI9 at some secluded alley. After obtaining the interrogator's Beyonder characteristic and having digested her sheriff potion, all she needed was the correct formula to advance to Sequence 7. It would be a crucial step for her investigation of the truth and restoring her family's honor. Therefore, she was eager to receive a few more missions from the military to accumulate the amount of contributions she needed. After doing all of this, she planned on circling Eastborough first to see if there was any important news. Then, she planned on returning home to Tail Firs, so that she could figure out what her good friend was up to, or if she was in any danger. However, the moment she entered Eastborough, she had a hunch that someone was staring at her. Chapter 820, 2 Dazed Instances. Who is it? As a sheriff, Xiao had a sharp intuition for monitoring others and for being monitored by others. Her heart tensed up as her mind raced to consider what had just happened. In the past 2 to 3 weeks, she hadn't encountered anything particularly noteworthy. The few criminals she apprehended weren't beyonders, and they were, at best, related to certain gangs. No one would offend a famous bounty hunter in Eastborough for them. Therefore, she quickly narrowed down the list of suspects, and she vaguely guessed at the spies faction. A member from the Aurora Order? I didn't attend Mr. X's gathering, and an accident happened. Apparently, it was quite a stunning scene. The person from MI9 said that Mr. X was assassinated on the spot, and had his corpse taken away. Furthermore, the assassin had used powers at the demigod level. Is the Aurora Order investigating the possible culprits? Every invitee is in their sights. Although Xiao was careless and short-tempered at times, her thought process was relatively direct. But in similar fields, she had a strong intuition that allowed her to figure out the crux of the matter. And on the matter regarding Mr. X's assassination, she had once been thankful that Firs had stopped her from attending, thus, avoiding the accident. On the other hand, she felt that there wasn't anything wrong about her, allowing her to stand up to the scrutiny of any investigation. Therefore, when she met the masked man from MI9 last week, she had been frank and confident, and she had accepted the mission to investigate the truth behind the matter. Unfortunately, she wasn't sure which other Beyonders had participated back then, and she had no clues to kick her off. That man from MI9 said that the members of Aurora Order are either lunatics or potential lunatics. You can't use common sense to guess at their actions. Even if they believe that there's nothing wrong with me, they can kill me in passing to vent their anger as a warning to the real murderer. The stressed Xiao walked forward as she revised her path in Eastborough. This new route allowed her to obtain the help of friends at any time. If she suffered an ambush, there was a considerable chance that she could escape or kill the assailant. As she walked, Xiao's mind suddenly went into a daze, as she realized that she had unknowingly arrived back at her residence in Sherwood Borough at some point in time. Xiao entered blankly and drank a cup of water when she was patted on the shoulder by Firs. Accompany me to Eastborough. Xiao was taken aback as she found herself saying something very familiar. You want to head out to gather material? Firs immediately said that it wasn't the case, indicating that she had previously accepted a mission to find the dust left behind after a ghost faded away. As the deceased had been given a send-off by the priests at the cemetery to their respective deities' kingdom, there wasn't any ghosts. Thus, they could only head over to Eastborough to find targets. Xiao hesitated and said, "Can't you push it back a day? I'm planning to participate in Mr. X's gathering." Firs immediately wore a bitter look and said that she had delayed it by too much, and the mission's deadline was looming. Xiao sighed and agreed to accompany her friend to Eastborough to find a deceased person that had just died or one that hadn't been discovered after a period of time since their death. Just as the two were about to exit, Xiao felt the wind strike her in the face as she trembled and snapped awake. She saw a wandering poet sitting in a corner, playing a 7-string guitar as he sang a folk song that was famous in the southern villages. Xiao frowned slightly as she rubbed her temples. She had a nagging feeling that her mind had gone adrift, but she couldn't remember what she was thinking about. She continued maintaining her vigilance as she followed her originally set route, entering a bar that sold lunch. On the way, she met an Eastborough resident who would occasionally provide her with intelligence. He was a man who was either 23 or 24 years old. He had thinned his brows, and his brown hair reached his shoulders. His facial features were rather soft, and he had put on cheap makeup. He gave off quite an odd vibe. Sherman, did anything happen in the past few days? Zio greeted. According to what she knew, this young man named Sherman had always thought of himself as a woman. However, fate had played a terrible joke on him, making him a man. This made him suffer serious levels of ostracization for many years. Sherman grinned and said, "It's been peaceful. No man offered to buy me any drinks." "Drinking is bad," Zio advised him seriously, walked past him, and walked to the bar counter. Sherman spat as he walked to the entrance, swaying his hips until he arrived at the condominium he rented. He paused at the door for nearly a minute before walking 2 steps to the side and knocking on the door next door. The wooden door creaked open as a low, female voice sounded with an undeniable sweetness to it. "Have you made your decision?" Sherman walked in and closed the door behind him. Looking towards the bed, he said to the black-dressed lady, "I'm still doubtful. I don't believe that there's something as magical as that." To him, the lady had a round face and a gentle and refined temperament. Not only was she sweet-looking, but she also had a different air to her. She was extremely charming and alluring. Of course, to Sherman, he was more envious instead of smitten. The black-dressed lady replied with a deadpan expression, "Haven't you seen the picture of my former appearance?" Her gaze moved as she couldn't help but feel a sense of melancholy. "But that might have been your twin brother." "I find it difficult to believe that there really is a substance to change me into a woman," Sherman said in a wavering tone. The black-dressed lady chuckled without any humor in it. "Then, you can pretend that it's fake. You may leave." Sherman's hands tightened as he fell silent for a long while. I am willing to give it a try. Although I know that you might be bluffing me, I still wish to give it a try." "Then, what should be the price I need to pay?" "Listen to my instructions, and help me do certain tasks." "Don't worry. They will definitely be things you are capable of," the black-dressed lady said. "To truly change your sex, you need to drink 3 potions and complete certain rituals. I'll guide you." Upon saying this, she said in a self-deprecating manner, "You can consider your female name." At night, in the Backland Bridge area, in a small alley at Iron Gate Street, Zio stood under a street lamp that had been shattered by someone. She was recounting what had happened in the morning. After confirming that she wasn't being tailed, she returned to Cherwood Burrow and secretly observed furs. She discovered that her friend didn't head out at all, staying at home like she usually did. She spent most of her time reading novels, newspapers, and magazines. She also drew the curtains in her room for nearly an hour, as though she was familiarizing herself with her beyonder powers. Until she had nothing to do, she got a piece of paper and spent 15 minutes writing the opening to her new book. Finally, she tore it apart, crumbled it into a ball, and threw it into the trash can. She smokes and drinks excessively. Zio silently clenched her teeth when she saw a figure in a black suit walking out of the shadows from the other end of the alley. The man was tall and wore a golden mask that revealed his eyes, nostrils, mouth, and cheeks. He was none other than the MI9 member who was in contact with Zio. "Is there anything urgent?" he asked directly. Although Zio was short, she said in a similarly domineering manner, "I was tailed in Eastborough. I suspect that it's someone from the Aurora Order. They seem to be investigating what happened during the gathering." The topic Zio had prepared to talk about was about someone she was asked to look for. She planned on using a clue that couldn't be confirmed, to make a request for the emergency meeting to appear normal. However, she now had a more suitable excuse thanks to the Aurora Order. The lunatics from the Aurora Order are like that. Although they know that we're also investigating the matter and are finding them, they don't shrink back. If it's not because of that, they wouldn't always be suffering setbacks, the golden-masked man said with a laugh. "To be frank, I'm very surprised that they didn't directly surround you and bring you to a secluded place to interrogate and channel your spirit." Zio was about to answer him that the Aurora Order member didn't tail her for long when she suddenly recalled the dazed feeling she found inexplicable. Hence, she deliberated and mentioned, "I'm not sure what I encountered. For a very brief period of time, I seemed to be in a daze and can't remember what I recalled." The golden-masked man fell silent. After nearly 20 seconds, he said, "The investigation pertaining to you should have ended. The importance the Aurora Order has placed on this matter has exceeded my imagination. I will report this matter." You mentioned that many Beyonders received the invitation but didn't attend? Zhao nodded and said, "The participants of each gathering doesn't exceed a third of the number of people invited. This is mostly normal for a gathering. It's not an exception for Mr. X's gathering either." The golden-masked man considered for a moment before asking, "Are there any clues about the person I got you to search for? The person whose original name was Trissy?" Zhao shook her head after seeing him nod. "Not yet. She's likely experienced." The golden-masked man immediately chuckled. "The number of people she has killed is more than the number of bounty missions you have completed. If you have any clues, make sure not to approach her. She's highly dangerous." Zhao tersely answered and focused on the main topic at hand. "Is there a new commission? Why have you suddenly become so proactive?" the golden-masked man asked in surprise. Zhao frankly replied, "I'm almost about to save up enough points to exchange for the interrogator potion formula. I wish to obtain it early. Actually, there's no need for that. You can directly exchange it for the potion, as it will save quite a bit of points," the golden-masked man suggested in Zhao's behalf. "I already have the Beyonder characteristic." Zhao shook her head and said, "That would still take a very long time. I might be able to buy the ingredients at other Beyonder gatherings." The golden-masked man didn't insist as he said with a laughing sigh, "I wish you luck. This time, it's a rather complicated commission. If you can complete it, you should have enough points." Zhao held back her delight and asked, "What's the mission?" The masked man said with a slightly odd tone, "Take note of the people Viscount Stratford interacts with, and list them down in a report before submitting it to me. There's no need for you to frequently monitor him. Whenever you are free or walk past, take note of it in passing. Trust me, you aren't the only one working on this mission. As long as you hand over a report of certain value a week, it'll be considered as you contributing a certain amount. This can be repeated every week. Viscount Stratford." Zhao suddenly fell into a daze again, but this time, she knew why. This Viscount was the captain of the Royal Guards. He was once her father's deputy. Chapter 821. Soul Imprint. Zhao was dazed for about 10 seconds before remembering the need to reply. She looked at the golden-masked man and nodded. "All right, I'll take note of the people Viscount Stratford interacts with." The golden-masked man seemed to sense her dazed state as he said, "There's another mission. The Church of Evernight's Red Gloves are investigating something related to the numinous episcopate. If you have any relevant information on that, immediately inform me." Zhao tersely responded, unable to extricate herself from her emotions. The golden-masked man fell silent for a few seconds and asked after some deliberation, "Are you interested in directly joining MI9? You can continue maintaining your present identity, being active in East Borough." Zhao was taken aback for 2 seconds as her mouth turned agape. She was momentarily unable to make a decision. The golden-masked man didn't require an immediate answer as he said with a smile, "There's no rush. Tell me your answer after you become an interrogator." After saying that, he walked back, step after step, slinking away into the shadows at the other end of the alley. That same evening, Klein snapped awake from a dream. The soul imprint he had set up in Baclun Street sewers had been touched. Who is it that isn't sleeping in the middle of the night? Is Hazel not afraid of being possessed by a wraith? Klein sighed helplessly as he took out the iron cigar case which was wrapped in a wall of spirituality from under his pillow. He then walked to the balcony where the curtains were tightly drawn. Wraith Senior rapidly leaped onto the surface of a street lamp before passing the manhole and sinking deep into the sewers. After advancing a short distance, with the eyes of his marionette, Klein saw Hazel in commoner clothes. This lady was warily walking forward as she raised her left hand without realizing it to touch the necklace with 7 emeralds. In her right hand was a charm made from gold. Although the charm hadn't been activated, it exuded the feeling of sunlight and warmth, as well as the refreshing sense of morning dew. Upon seeing this scene, Klein suddenly recalled his encounter when strolling in the morning. Hazel had woken up early to stroll in her garden. She was gathering materials to create the sun domain charm. Morning dew? Klein guessed with uncertainty as he felt a little puzzled. This was because Hazel wasn't only half illiterate in the mysterious domain, but she also lacked quite a bit of knowledge. Furthermore, she was a believer of the Evernight goddess. Such a beyonder wouldn't receive any response if she prayed to the eternal blazing Sunday. Even if something special happened, the smallest probability event would be that of receiving punishment. As she hasn't been digging and searching in the sewers for too long, that beyonder that has been guiding her with a dream has turned anxious. That's why she was taught how to make sun domain charms via a dream? From the Marauder pathway, the corresponding high sequence representative, Amon, is also known as a blasphemer. Does this mean that at a certain sequence of this pathway, they have the ability to pretend to be believers of other deities and circle around any defenses to obtain a response and create various kinds of charms? This does match their modus operandi. With Señor's vision, Klein watched Hazel walk deep into the sewers. Based on his spiritual intuition, although the sun domain charm was targeted at a wraith, it was far from sufficient to truly threaten a sequence 5, with it dealing a certain amount of damage at best. After all, Hazel had no way of obtaining high-level materials. However, Klein didn't let his wraith possess her again, afraid that it would alarm that beyonder who was influencing Hazel. After tomorrow's tarot gathering, he believed he would obtain a low-level item from the Marauder pathway, allowing him to make the corresponding investigations. Before that, maintaining the status quo was the best choice. Of course, the premise was that he was certain that Hazel wasn't able to dig up anything within a day or two. He had plenty of time to prepare. As a seer, he had many ways to make a confirmation. The simplest way was to head above the gray fog. After retracting his marionette, Klein took 4 steps counterclockwise and arrived inside the ancient palace which had stone columns propping it up. He conjured a pen and paper, and he wrote down the corresponding divination statement: something major will happen in Buklun Street over the next 3 days. With the topaz pendulum, Klein obtained a negative revelation. This also meant that in 3 days, no major incident would happen in Buklun Street. As for the possibility of what Hazel would really dig out, it would only affect him while being trivial to Buklun Street. He wasn't fazed. This was because something trivial wouldn't affect his subsequent plans. He didn't have any strong intentions of stopping her. He had previously given a hint to her at the ball. If Hazel didn't understand or didn't take it to heart, it was her problem. Klein didn't have any psychological burden on such matters. After returning to the real world, he waited for 45 minutes before Hazel came out. After confirming that no significant changes happened underground, Klein laid back in bed, and with cogitation, he quickly fell asleep. Monday afternoon at 3. Dark red beams of light that soared up from both sides of the long bronze table appeared before the fool Klein's, the sun Derek's, and the world Gehrman Sparrow's eyes. Justice Audrey remained in a good mood as she bowed at the figure shrouded in gray fog. "Good afternoon, Mr. Fool," Klein nodded with a smile as a response to this lady who often delighted him. Meanwhile, Audrey swept her gaze and discovered an additional card beside Mr. Fool's hand. A new card of blasphemy? I wonder which pathway it's from. I really wish that it's from the spectator pathway. Audrey's heart stirred as she turned to greet the other members. Once everything was done, she looked to the end of the model table ahead of the hermit Catlia and said, "Honorable Mr. Fool, I've found 3 new pages of Roselle's diary. This was actually obtained from the Lone Relic Search and Preservation Foundation, but as its founder and main sponsor, she easily received the opportunity to make a copy." Audrey was rather proud in regards to this. She was increasingly convinced that establishing such a foundation was a wise decision of hers. Unfortunately, to not expose her identity, she didn't share this matter with the other members of the Tarot Club. Very good. Klein smiled with a nod, indicating that Miss Justice could conjure the diary. And at this moment, the hermit Catlia didn't interject, as though she hadn't obtained any new Roselle diary pages. There's temporarily no response from Queen Mystic? Or has she focused her attention on something else? Klein looked at the 3 diary pages which Miss Justice had conjured as he allowed them to jump into his palm. When he scanned them, the corners of Klein's lips nearly twitched. This was because he had encountered a familiar page of one of Roselle's sexual escapades. Compared to the pages specially chosen by Queen Mystic Bernadette that had plenty of information, the other members often obtained parts that weren't too important. The content tended to be about Roselle's daily life. The 3 pages that Miss Justice had provided was such an example. Klein casually flipped through them and discovered a diary entry that was worth a detailed read. As for the rest, it was either about him having a rendezvous with some lady or madam, or him belittling people who survived due to their status instead of intellect. He even expressed his desire for a demoness from all the rumors he heard. Soon, Klein placed his attention on the most valuable diary entry. Based on the information obtained from the church, there really are monsters in existence that are stitched at the soul level. After high-sequence Beyonders die, the Beyonder characteristics they produce will have remnants of the imprint of their soul. It can be very powerful and resilient. It might not even fully dissipate after centuries or even a millennium. But when Beyonder characteristics form a mystical item with their surrounding objects, there's a need to have a sufficiently similar soul in order to use them, otherwise, the negative effects will be extraordinary. And when such Beyonder characteristics are preserved and made into the main ingredient of a potion, the consumer similarly must have a powerful soul body to withstand it, otherwise, there's a high chance of failure. In mysticism, an advancement's failure will often lead to a loss of control or death. Only very few lucky ones can be calmed down and maintain an intricate balance. However, it's rumored that certain special sealed artifacts can draw out unfused Beyonder characteristics and recondense them. It would be akin to not having consumed the potion, so the failures will only suffer a storm-like assault on their soul. But according to my conjectures, there's likely some level of mutation at the gene level. This is because, based on the information provided, those who failed their advancement and survived by this method had mostly died from terminal illnesses within 5 years. Therefore, consuming a potion similar to one's soul body can effectively decrease the difficulty of advancements, but it will leave behind remnant soul imprints. Unknowingly, one will suffer an identity dissociation, and they would slowly transform into a monster stitched at the soul level. It's just like that high-sequence Beyonder who resurrected on his body. Resurrected. On careful thought, it's really quite terrifying. However, the church told me that there are roughly 3 methods to rid the high-sequence Beyonder soul imprints in a Beyonder characteristic. As for what they are, they didn't tell me. They don't seem simple. It's no wonder the Sauron family enjoys calling descendants who look similar to their ancestors as having talent. Talent. I have to say that I do pity Florin quite a bit. Monsters stitched at the soul level. High-sequence Beyonder soul imprints. Sounds a little alarming. So high-sequence Beyonder potions have such a problem. The churches probably have a way to resolve them. They have no lack of angels and grade 0 sealed artifacts. They can shatter a Beyonder characteristic and recondense them, thus obtaining a purified one. Those ancient families probably aren't that lucky. They might not have any more angels protecting them. They might only have 1 or 2 grade 0 sealed artifacts, but they aren't that easily used. Furthermore, different grade 0 sealed artifacts have different uses. They might not be adequate for such matters. Klein's mind raced as he made the diary pages in his hand vanish. Then, he looked at Miss Justice and asked with a chuckle, "What do you wish to exchange them for?" Audrey was waiting for her potion ingredients, and she temporarily had nothing she lacked. Therefore, without any hesitation, she chose to satisfy her curiosity. "Honorable Mr. Fool, is that an additional card by your hand, a card of blasphemy? Which one is it?" Chapter 822, Another I Knew It. Miss Justice wouldn't not ask when she sees an additional card. I got through another question so easily. Klein secretly smiled as he casually flipped over the new card of blasphemy, showing it to Justice. Tyrant. As expected, Gehrman Sparrow has handed it over. That was Mr. Fool's goal? Alger eagerly glanced at Emperor Roselle in a papal tiara as he thought poignantly. He had already obtained the cataclysmic Inter potion formula, and he knew what ritual was needed. He was in a great mood and felt that, although there were obstacles ahead of him, he was filled with radiance and hope. Audrey quickly took in the details of the card of blasphemy. Tyrant card. It looks like it's the sailor pathway. How I envy Mr. Hanged Man. Mr. Hanged Man doesn't seem alarmed or surprised. From a psychological point of view, his reaction should have been greater than mine. He was already aware that it was the Sailor Pathway's card of blasphemy? Eliminating all other impossibilities, this is the only explanation. But how did Mr. Hanged Man know of it ahead of time? Sequence 0, Tyrant. The potion name corresponding to the Lord of Storms is Tyrant. This Tyrant card was likely in the form of the Hierophant, however, the actual meaning has certain discrepancies with some similarities. Some of it is inversed, and some are just an extension. In short, the interpretation of the card is that of a conservative view, an emphasis on submission at the level of the soul. By relying on dominance and strength, fear is created to bring about faith. Audrey, who had liked mysticism from a young age, interpreted it as she felt a strong sense of satisfaction. She felt that the payment of 3 Roselle diary pages was especially worth it. Card of blasphemy. Being equally good at interpretation and being knowledgeable, Katlia also quickly figured out the pathway in which the card represented. She also managed to add Sequence 0, Tyrant to the gaps in her knowledge. Apart from these facts, she also made a connection. The world Gehrman Sparrow plotted the death of sea god Calvetua, thus, allowing Mr. Fool to obtain that scepter representing sea god's authority and begin answering believers in the name of sea god. This time, he obtained the Tyrant card of the Storm Pathway. It's definitely no coincidence. As she thought about the matter, Katlia was suddenly alarmed, suspecting that Mr. Fool was secretly attempting to erode away the Lord of Storm's authority. A battle between gods. It's a massive plan that has a far-reaching influence. This is one of the true goals of Mr. Fool. As thoughts flashed through Katlia's mind, she retracted her gaze and stopped looking at the Tyrant card. Furs and Emlyn didn't understand much about Sequence 0. They had only heard Mr. Fool mention it once at a previous tarot gathering, therefore, they were only surprised that it was a card of blasphemy. They also began to link the name Tyrant and the Sequence 0's potion name to the Lord of Storms. The former began trembling a little, feeling as though she was being sacrilegious. As for the latter, he began imagining and guessing what was the name of the artificial vampire pathway's Sequence 0. It must be Moon. Or Crimson Moon. Emlyn's mind raced as he came to an answer. As for whether it was correct, he didn't mind it at all. He just felt that it was definitely close to the truth. Having grown up in the City of Silver, Derek had received quite a solid education in mysticism. He wasn't unfamiliar with the concept of Sequence 0, and he had even aimed his sights to becoming one at that level. Only by doing so could he bring the City of Silver out into the light and warmth, so as to bring hope and a future. This likely represents Elf King Saniathrim. So it's called Tyrant. However, his authority seems to be a little more than what the card represents. Derek thought as he participated in the ongoings of the tarot gathering in a rare instance. After showing it for 2 seconds, the Fool Klein covered the Tyrant card again before casually glancing at Ma'am Hermit. Katlia hurriedly said, "Honorable Mr. Fool, there aren't any new Roselle diary pages this time." As expected. Klein nodded gently and said with a smile, "That's all from me." Just as he said that, the world Gehrman Sparrow looked at the Hanged Man. "After this gathering, I'll send you that ocean songster's Beyonder characteristic. Can you find an artisan to create an easily portable mystical item? Another ocean songster Beyonder characteristic?" The same thought surfaced in the minds of Audrey, Emlyn, and company. Powerful Sequence 5 Beyonders weren't carrots that you could easily buy on the street. And Mr. World had killed several in the past 2 months. Which quasi-high-ranking member of the Church of Storms met harm this time? Catlia started off with her conjecture that Mr. Fool was attempting to erode away the Lord of Storm's authority as she came to such a thought. Furs became increasingly fearful of Gehrman Sparrow as she kept warning herself not to use the 2 pages with demigod level beyond her powers. Derek couldn't help but think back to how City of Silver teams would clear a region of monsters. In that dark environment of despair, the number of Sequence 5 main ingredients and Beyonder characteristics were few and far between. There were even instances where there weren't any at times. "All right," Alger, who had already made the promise, calmly replied without mentioning the artisan's fees. This made people like Audrey and Catlia notice something. They suspected that Mr. World and Mr. Hanged Man had secretly cooperated and negotiated on certain matters. This coincided with Audrey's belief that the Hanged Man had the knowledge that the card of blasphemy was the Tyrant card, making her guess that the Tyrant card might have been one of the spoils of war that they had obtained in a private partnership. Without waiting for them to ask about anything they needed, the World Gehrman Sparrow surveyed the area whilst under Klein's control. "I have here another Beyonder characteristic of a Sequence 5 Mentor of Confusion from the Black Emperor sequence pathway. It can be made into a mystical item, and it should possess the power to use the loopholes found in order so as to distort the words, will, and actions of a target. It can also raise one's physical state and create a certain degree of chaos and confusion to the surroundings." He described it in such detail because his target clients were Miss Justice and Ma'am Hermit. It was impossible for the 2 of them to switch to the Black Emperor pathway, so their requirements for Beyonder characteristics were naturally for a mystical item. Of course, the latter had subordinates, so it was possible to purchase Beyonder characteristics for her organization's members. Another one. And it's Sequence 5. What major event did Mr. World do last week? Audrey instantly forgot to generate interest in the Beyonder characteristic. Catlia, Emlyn, and company exchanged looks, puzzled as to which Sequence 5 Beyonder met harm again. What Alger cared about was that this belonged to the Black Emperor pathway, a Sequence 5 Mentor of Confusion. The latter was something he wasn't previously aware of. After nearly 20 seconds of silence, Audrey began to ruminate over Mr. World's words. Use loopholes found in order. Create chaos and confusion, raise one's physical state, and distort a target's speech, will, and actions. It seems to be very compatible with my dear Earl Hall. Besides, I also want to have such powers. I still have too many shortcomings just by relying on myself and lie. I should figure out the price first and find a chance to ask Father. Let's see if he's interested in buying such a mystical item for himself or his adorable daughter." Audrey thought for a few seconds before raising her hand slightly. "Mr. World, what do you plan on exchanging it for? Or how much do you plan on selling it for?" A reasonable price for a ready-made mystical item like Death Knell costs 10,000 to 12,000 pounds. Just the Beyonder characteristic alone will be cheaper. It will be about 7,000 to 8,000 pounds. Klein had already done the math. Now, after some thought, he made the World Gehrman Sparrow reply, 8,000 pounds. He knew that if Miss Justice was really interested, she wouldn't haggle. "Okay." Audrey nodded and turned to look across the table. "Mr. Hanged Man, roughly how much would it cost to pay the artisan to turn such a Beyonder characteristic into a mystical item?" Alger quickly did the math and said, 1,500 pounds at the very least. "It might be higher." "All right." Audrey shifted her gaze and said to the World Gehrman Sparrow, "I'll consider it for a few days and give you an answer by the end of the week. You can continue asking if anyone else wants it." The World nodded in silence as he looked at the other members. He noticed that Ma'am Hermit hesitated for 2 seconds but ultimately kept silent. As for the rest, they were only watching with interest. Just as Audrey was about to ask about the fruit of the illusory chime tree, all the members heard the World Gehrman Sparrow hoarsely say, "There's another Sequence 5 Beyonder characteristic from the Planter pathway, Druid." Suddenly, the palace that looked like a giant's residence turned extremely quiet. Apart from Mr. Fool, who continued observing everyone in a leisurely manner, the Hanged Man Alger didn't show any additional thoughts. Another. When did Sequence 5 Beyonder characteristics become so common? What did he do? Katlia suddenly felt baffled. She felt that the risk and hard work she had put in over the years was, in essence, no different to the commercial goods the World Gehrman Sparrow was selling. It's terrifying. Furs had already begun imagining a series of stories. Impressive. Derek idolized Mr. World even more. Audrey and Emlyn remained silent for a long time, momentarily finding themselves suffering from a lack of vocabulary. After nearly 10 seconds, Katlia realized the hidden meaning behind the World Gehrman Sparrow's words. He didn't mention the effects of what the Druid Beyonder characteristic can have after being made into a mystical item. He's asking me if I'll buy it for Frank? At that instant, Katlia felt an unprecedented dilemma. Chapter 823, The Maturing Tarot Club. As the captain of the future, Katlia knew of the latent dangers that Frank Lee had better than anyone else. She knew that this first mate's strange ideas would at times be about truly terrifying and crazy developments. If it wasn't because those creations had yet to be proliferated and lacked the necessary elements, Katlia believed that the world would be different. Of course, if there came such a day, she would finish off Frank Lee ahead of everyone else by feeding him to the fishes. With him lacking godhood, many things will be limited in scope even if they're considered a success. It's impossible to distribute out and bring about a greater disaster. Just advancing to sequence 5 wouldn't result in any qualitative changes, and Frank has been holding back greatly in recent times. He's been focused on researching plants that can survive and grow through the absorption of monster corpses in the darkness. As her thoughts swirled and changed in her mind, Katlia finally made a decision. How much do you wish to get for it? She had a vague feeling that the World Gehrman Sparrow was recently in need of money. 8,000 pounds. If you can replace it with large sums of gold coins, you'll receive a discount. Klein secretly heaved a sigh of relief as he answered using the world. At the thought of how Frank Lee could be able to afford this sum, and how he wouldn't reject a Druid's Beyonder characteristic, Katlia pondered for 2 seconds and said, "Deal. Give me a week to gather the amount." "No problem." Klein got the World Gehrman Sparrow to retract his gaze. After the trip to the primitive island, if not for having garnered the attention of the existence hidden in the depths of the cathedral, he would have given himself a perfect score. In less than half a night, he had obtained an invaluable card of blasphemy, a mystical item with not less than 10,000 pounds, as well as a possible total of 16,000 pounds. Furthermore, no taxes needed to be paid. It was faster than robbing a bank. Unfortunately, that primitive island has vanished. Otherwise, I can always pay a visit when I'm lacking money. Klein's thoughts wandered as he watched Miss Justice look at Mr. Hanged Man and ask with a tone of anticipation, "Do you have the fruits of the illusory chime tree?" Audrey actually had some inkling to the answer. This was because Mr. World had obtained so many Sequence 5 Beyonder characteristics recently, and Mr. Hanged Man was suspected to have had a private partnership with him in the past week. It was unlikely that he had obtained nothing. I can figure out certain clues from Mr. Hanged Man's satisfied and confident state. Audrey felt increasingly confident in her ability to observe others. Alger chuckled and said, "I was just about to tell you that I've already obtained the fruit." "Excellent." Audrey held back and didn't act overly agitated. This meant that she had gathered all the ingredients for hypnotist. All she needed to do was wait for her psychiatrist potion to completely digest before she attempted the advancement. And it wouldn't take too long. Having already become an Aunt Agony in the aristocrat circles in Eastchester County, Audrey thought with great certainty. To be frank, if she hadn't deliberately guided the topic of conversation, Audrey wouldn't have imagined that the aristocrats that all looked beaming with decent demeanors suffered immense stress. They had pains that others would find impossible to imagine. The changes of the times and the trends of society made them worried about the futures of their families and self. Of course, this was also related to them not being powerful aristocrats, as well as the limited resources they held on hand. These matters made Audrey truly understand the concept of a facade. She understood that faced with different targets, everyone wore a different facade. After concluding such situations, she had instantly digested a significant amount of her psychiatrist potion as her progress clearly sped up. Perhaps, in 2 weeks, more or less. In short, before I return to Backlund, I should be able to become a hypnotist. Audrey looked at Alger with bright eyes and asked, "What do you want in exchange?" Having advanced to sequence 5 recently, and having obtained the key to the door of demigods, as well as being about to possess a potent mystical item, Alger was lacking in money the most at the moment. Therefore, he said without any hesitation, £2,000. Deal. Audrey agreed with relatively great ease. This amount of money didn't need a reimbursement, for she could easily afford it herself. After completing the transaction, Audrey couldn't help but heave a sigh of relief. She finally didn't feel like she was falling behind in the tarot club. During this period of time, she had watched Furs become a sequence 7, and watched Mr. Hanged Man approach the level of a high sequence Beyonder. She also saw Mr. World finish off one sequence 5 Beyonder after another, producing their corresponding Beyonder characteristics again and again. Yet, she remained as a psychiatrist, a sequence 7 Beyonder. She couldn't help but feel stressed as she became a little anxious. She relied solely on placating herself, and Susie's counseling, to prevent any emotional problems from happening. Now, she had finally taken a step forward towards becoming sequence 6. As the delighted Audrey increasingly enjoyed the gathering, she heard Ma'am Hermit say to Mr. World, "I can provide an answer to that drop of blood from the mythical creature. Do you wish for a private communication?" The fool Klein controlled the World Gehrman Sparrow with piqued interest as he asked. "If it's solely an exchange of information, I'll make a killing out of nothing," he thought with anticipation. Katlia looked around, and after a few seconds of thought, she shook her head and said, "There's no need. I can only provide 2 forms of payment. 1, a single glance at the Wheel of Fortune card. I believe you know what this card of blasphemy that was created by Emperor Roselle means. 2, it's to provide the means to regain a certain amount of strength during one's weak stages. Please pass this message to that angel, and ask if he is satisfied with such a payment. Provide the means to regain a certain amount of strength during one's weak stages? Queen Mystic has guessed that it's related to the Snake of Fate? That doesn't make sense. An angel includes a sequence 2 soothsayer. Can't the fool have an angel from the Fate pathway serving him? I've no idea if Willa Septon knows the way to become the corresponding pathway sequence 0. If he is unaware, then taking one look at the Wheel of Fortune card would be an irresistible temptation. However, it's unlikely. He has lived for so long, and he's a sequence 1 at that. It wouldn't be so terrible to the point of only now grasping the ritual to becoming a god. Heh, I wonder what Roselle looks like on the Wheel of Fortune card. It has a snake with the Emperor's face and other animals. Klein casually thought as he deliberated and made the fake person, the world, say, "Okay. If a transaction is ultimately made, you will need to pay an additional amount." "What do you want?" Katlia asked cautiously. The World Gehrman Sparrow said with a hoarse laugh, "I want to meet Queen Mystic." "Don't worry. The matter is very simple. There's just something that needs her help." After a moment of silence, Katlia said, "I can only try my best to facilitate it, but I can't give any guarantees." Upon hearing their conversation, Audrey suddenly found it surreal. Has the Tarot Club already matured to such a level? Aside from Mr. Fool, from us only being able to exchange basic knowledge in mysticism and sequence 9 potion formulas, it has developed into transactions involving cards of blasphemy and the blood of mythical creatures. It hadn't even been a year. It's like a dream. I've also matured significantly. As Audrey sighed, the hermit Katlia continued looking at the World Gehrman Sparrow and said, "There's some news regarding the Marauder Pathway mystical item you want." As she spoke, she requested Mr. Fool's help to conjure an item that resembled a tweezer. This tweezer was grayish-white in color, as though they were formed from 2 finger bones. Apart from that, it was relatively ordinary. Katlia introduced, "It's called Broken Finger. It can enhance the stability and agility of your wrist and fingers. It allows you to easily steal items in the pockets of your target without being discovered. The negative effect is kleptomania when worn. It costs £500. It corresponds to sequence 9 Marauder. There's a slight premium involved. Klein considered for a moment and said, all right. Let's close the transaction as soon as possible. This way, he could investigate the region dug up by Hazel in the sewers, so as to eliminate any hidden risks. After the conversation between the duo ended, Furs asked with the intention to express interest in a purchase so that she could use it when the need arose. I need a cursed item from an ancient wraith, as well as its remnant spirituality. Please help me take note. After she obtained a positive reply from the members, the moon Emlyn sized up his surroundings and leaned back into his chair, and he said to the sun Derek, does your city of silver have the Beyonder characteristic that corresponds to sequence 5 of the artificial vampires? He didn't wish to call the fellows covered in pus as described by the sun as sanguine, therefore, he changed the way he phrased his question. From his point of view, since there were often mutated vampires appearing around the city of silver, then obtaining 1 or 2 sequence 5 Beyonder characteristics wasn't too difficult. Furthermore, they clearly lacked the potion formula of this pathway as well as an artisan. Their retention of these Beyonder characteristics depends only on luck. Time needs to pass to determine if they would corrupt the items surrounding them, transforming into sealed artifacts. Emlyn convinced himself that he was helping the City of Silver instead of asking for the sun's help. Derek was stunned as he answered in complete honesty, yes. But Mr. Moon, do you wish to be covered in pus? Ah. Emlyn's expression froze as he was momentarily unsure if the sun was mocking him or warning him. Upon seeing this, Derek hurriedly added, many of them have serious levels of mental corruption, and without the potion formula, our City of Silver wouldn't waste the effort to cleanse such problems. Is that so? This will be troublesome. Emlyn nodded slightly and said, got it. He didn't involve himself in possible transactions, preparing to seek advice from the upper echelons of the Sanguine to figure out the matter regarding the mental corruption of Beyonder characteristics. With the transaction segment coming to an end, the Tarot Club's members began their free exchange segment. Audrey looked straight at Gehrman Sparrow and said with some hesitation, I would like to know where the Mentor of Confusion characteristic came from. If it involves certain secrets, you can choose not to answer. She was making the preparations to convince her father, Earl Hall. It was also to avoid any unnecessary troubles. After all, Beyonders from the Black Emperor pathway might have certain connections with the military and royal family. Klein secretly laughed as he made the world answer, it comes from a curly-haired baboon. Chapter 824, Conflict. It comes from a curly-haired baboon. Audrey was momentarily unsure if Mr. World was referring to a real curly-haired baboon or someone who couldn't be considered human. In the Lone Kingdom, curly-haired baboons were a common term used to mock others, often used as a joke for low intelligence. From the looks of it, Mr. World doesn't wish to provide any further explanation. All right then, I'll just treat its origins as that of a real curly-haired baboon. Audrey didn't ask further as she said, didn't I visit a place that had the tradition of worshipping dragons while seeking out the traces of a mind dragon? But didn't you discover that the mind dragon lived in the sea of collective subconscious in the local residents? And to ensure your safety, you chose to leave? Catlia replied. You went back? Furs asked with a guess. Audrey shook her head. No, I've long left the area. I've only heard of a rumor recently. An archaeological team entered one of the villages in that area. A member suddenly went mad at night, and the mental illness seemed contagious. The other members went mad in turn as they killed each other or themselves. Eventually, not a single member survived. Alger was just about to say something when Catlia said, this matches the traits of a mind dragon. I have no doubts about that. I'm just curious if the mind dragon will remain in that region, Audrey expressed her thoughts. No, Alger and Catlia replied in unison. Sitting at the long model table, the fool Klein made a connection to something else. The anchor of the deities. He suspected that the region's tradition of dragon worship was an anchor to stabilize the mind dragon state. Before such tradition ceased its practice, that mind dragon likely doesn't need to worry about the problem of an anchor. Therefore, after it leaves, it can hide in a new region's sea of collective subconscious. It doesn't need to take risks to enter the different dreams to create faith. This way, the three churches will lack clues to finding it. After all, they aren't experts in this domain. Even with the corresponding sealed artifacts, they will, at best, only be capable of entering the sea of collective subconscious or force the mind dragon out. Instead, the psychology alchemists might be able to figure something out. As Klein thought casually, he made the world say, the tradition of dragon worship is very beneficial in stabilizing the mind dragon's condition. You can get people to take note of such matters. If large-scale changes occur, then it means that the mind dragon is creating similar traditions in other places. He originally wanted to mention that he suspected the mind dragon to be an angel, one at sequence 2, but on careful thought, he found it impossible to determine that. Indeed, when humans reach sequence 2 and reach the level of an angel, they will need the anchor of faith to secure themselves to prevent themselves from going mad. But that is a dragon in the true sense of the word, an ancient beyonder creature. It has the madness inherited from its ancestors, and even if it's cleansed and weakened every generation, it's definitely easier for it to lose itself compared to humans. Therefore, it might be a sequence 3, or even a sequence 4 that needs an anchor to resist its inclination of losing control. That folk tradition is beneficial in stabilizing the dragon's condition? Audrey asked in doubt and puzzlement. Yes. The world didn't give an explanation aside from providing an affirmative response. Audrey subconsciously turned her head to look at the other end of the long bronze table. She began considering if she needed to consult Mr. Fool and pay the corresponding price. Upon seeing this, the Fool Klein surveyed the area and said with a chuckle, "Why do you think the various deities want to spread their faith? This. Isn't it because God loves the world so much?" This standard and orthodox answer surfaced in Audrey's mind. Following that, she, Alger, Catlia, and the other members thought of the second answer. Stabilization of one's condition. No way. At that moment, Furs found her brain lacking. No matter how good she was at coming up with stories, there was no way she could come up with something like that. To think that's the case. No, I can't eliminate the possibility that Mr. Fool is only mentioning one of the possible reasons. He is secretly eroding away the Lord of Storm's authority. This is related to godhood? I should consult Her Majesty about this in the future. Catlia nudged the heavy glasses on her nose bridge as she made a guess. Alger had previously seen the picture, and when he heard such matters, he no longer had that trembling sense of paralyzing fear. Instead, he began seriously considering why faith could stabilize the conditions of a demigod creature. The other members, including Derek, felt a little horrified. They felt that what they had heard was sacrilegious. They didn't dare think too deeply about it or say a word. This wasn't something that only involved the evil gods like the true creator. It had an intimate connection to the 7 orthodox deities and the existence of the City of Silver creator. The Fool Klein didn't say anything further as he allowed them to maintain their silence while he appeared extremely relaxed. After about 10 seconds, Audrey forced a smile and said, "That's all I've encountered recently." What she meant was that was all from her, and it was the others' turn. Furs and Emlyn had nothing they encountered that was worth informing to the others. They shook their heads, indicating that they had nothing to say. Of course, the latter actually wished to flaunt his victory of the hunting competition that won him the ring made by the ancestor. Alger thought for a moment and looked at Gehrman Sparrow. Can that picture be shared with everyone? He believed that the picture was directly connected with certain matters that happened in Afternoon Town and the Giant King's court. It gave the Sun some prior knowledge of what would be discovered or encountered if the City of Silver were to continue exploring. From that, he would be prepared ahead of time, allowing him to avoid danger. And it was because of this that sharing was a better choice than keeping it to himself. "I don't mind." Klein had similar considerations as he made the world reply. "What picture?" "It seems to be very important." "This is a picture Mr. Hanged Man and Mr. World saw during their partnership in finding the Tyrant card?" Audrey waited in curiosity. Gazes were cast over as Alger obtained Mr. Fool's approval as he conjured the picture of the City of Silver creator being eaten by the kings of angels. The bloody, sinister, terrifying, and dark picture instantly left the Tarot Club members stunned. Even the knowledgeable Katlia momentarily lost her ability to think. Who are they? What are they doing? This is way too brutal a meal, right? Us sanguine no longer do such things ever since the fourth epoch. We respect life and only drink blood. Emlyn was quite stunned by what he saw. As he had never seen the 6 statues in the Tudor ruin, he was unable to recognize the 3 figures. Back when the world shared the images of the 6 statues, he had yet to join the Tarot Club. However, he recognized the victim from the resplendent cross. He was likely, perhaps, probably the creator of the City of Silver, the legendary ancient sun god. In a previous free exchange segment, the sun had shared with them the corresponding symbols and sacred emblem of the Lord that created everything. Isn't this the eternal blazing sun, the Lord of storms, and the God of knowledge and wisdom who Mr. World once presented? Why are they eating a human? No, they are feasting on the ancient sun god, the creator of the City of Silver. Audrey was dumbstruck as she instinctively suspected if someone had distorted or blasphemed the images of the orthodox deities. As Furs trembled in fear, she found the picture that was filled with darkness and evilness to have a form of aesthetics and was of high artistic value. In her mind, she had already come up with a title for the picture, The Last Supper. Katlia had never seen the 6 deity statues before, and she only knew the ancient sun god. She subconsciously frowned and blurted out, "Kings of angels?" Yes, at least the 3 present were, Alger said without any doubts. However, he wasn't sure who the dark infant inside the City of Silver creator was. As he spoke, Alger glanced at Derek and noticed that the youth's eyes were glazed over, his thoughts a mystery. At this moment, Derek's mind was filled with misery and despair. He believed that the one being eaten was the creator which the City of Silver believed in. He had also recognized the surrounding 3 to be the eternal blazing sun, the Lord of storms, and the God of knowledge and wisdom. This made him suspect the term, Forsaken Land of God. In the various tomes in the City of Silver, they emphasized that God had forsaken the land due to certain reasons. It made them turn into the people of the dark. Therefore, as long as everyone repented from the bottom of their hearts and pleaded for forgiveness, the day would come when God would truly return to illuminate the entire world with sunlight. That's not right. No amount of repentance or seeking forgiveness can redeem the City of Silver. Derek muttered inwardly. That's because God is dead. Eaten and never to return. This meant that the City of Silver's miserable pursuits and hope were only a mirage, one that would never be fulfilled. After a long silence, Audrey said, trying to convince herself, this is a distortion of the legend of how those 3 gods were born from the soul of the Creator. 3 gods? Katlia's and Emlyn's eyes constricted at the same time, having figured out the general meaning of the picture. They knew what alarming matter it represented. Perhaps, but there's no way to explain that infant, Alger replied. He silently glanced at Mr. Fool, and he realized that this impressive existence had no intention of speaking. All he did was watch silently. With Audrey silent, the remaining members of the Tarot Club didn't say a word either. This silence continued until Alger dispersed the picture and turned to ask Derek, "Have you investigated the matter regarding your former chief's mausoleum?" Chapter 825, Reservation. Upon hearing Mr. Hanged Man's question, Derek replied in shame, "No. I've been constantly assigned to patrol missions recently, and I didn't have the time to investigate." Alger wasn't too surprised, but he was puzzled over one thing. Why don't you get the help of a few friends? You don't have to tell them your true motives. Split the task into very minor missions that wouldn't garner much attention. Let them search for information in different areas. This way, even if anything gets exposed, it wouldn't implicate them in a fatal way. Derek fell silent for a few seconds before saying, "I do not have friends." Before his parents died, he had a certain number of friends from general education classes and those at the combat training field. After all, there weren't many people that are roughly the same age in the City of Silver. They often got to meet each other, and they would even become teammates. However, after his parents' death, Derek had become introverted for a very long period of time. Burdened by the secret of the Tarot Club, he unknowingly distanced himself from his friends and stopped interacting with them. The last time someone visited him at home was Dark Regents, who had been corrupted by the true creator. Alger choked on the son's reply. After taking a breath, he reorganized his words. That's not a good thing. You won't be able to rescue the City of Silver just by relying on yourself. You have to unite a group of people, friends who can provide you with help during critical moments. But this will make them be suspected, the son said hesitantly. Alger immediately said sternly, being suspected is better than being dead. The City of Silver is now at a dangerous crossroad. You have to carefully consider what needs to be done. It's impossible for there to be no sacrifices in such matters. There will even be a large number of sacrifices. Do you wish for their sacrifices to be worthless, or to be of value? He didn't provide any further persuading words as he allowed Derek to inwardly struggle over what he had just said. Mr. Hanged Man is always able to find a reason to convince someone. Klein sighed and made the World Gehrman Sparrow turn his head to look at Justice Audrey. Are you currently able to treat relatively serious mental illnesses? His only understanding of a psychiatrist was frenzy and dragon might. He knew little about the rest, having only heard Miss Justice occasionally mention placate and psychological cue. Therefore, he wasn't sure how capable she was at treating mental illnesses. Audrey's attention was caught as she eagerly replied, "Yes, I can. There's no problem. Mr. World, do you have a friend that requires treatment? I happen to lack patience." She thought in excitement. At this moment, Emlyn raised his right hand and held it to his mouth and nose, as though he already knew the answer. Klein silently sighed and made the World said with a low chuckle. "No, I'm the one who needs treatment." The entire magnificent palace suddenly turned extremely silent. Alger, Catlia, and Furs all knew that Mr. World was a crazy adventurer, but they never expected him to have a relatively serious mental illness that brought him to the brink of complete insanity. This is the price for strength? Furs trembled as she felt increasingly afraid of Gehrman Sparrow. Communication and reasoning were still possible with a crazy adventurer, but it was impossible with a lunatic. The mental terror candle wasn't able to fully treat his mental illness? It has already reached such a severe state. Emlyn, who had expected this, felt that the world could go mad at any moment. Derek didn't think too much about it, solely feeling concerned for Mr. World. He had wanted to say that the City of Silver had a psyche analyst that could provide treatment, but realized that it would expose too many problems. All he could do was shut his mouth as he looked at Miss Justice with an expectant look. Audrey was alarmed, lost, and puzzled. She said with some deliberation, "Mr. World, based on my observation, you shouldn't have any relatively serious mental illnesses. If it's just anxiety and immense pressure, you can condition yourself and properly relax yourself to recover. There's no need for direct treatment." The World Gehrman Sparrow chuckled and said, "The reason you didn't discover it is because the mental illness from before has been treated. I'm only making a reservation. If similar signs appear again in the future, I wish to receive timely treatment." "I see." Audrey nodded in enlightenment. She suddenly felt a little pity for Mr. World. She felt that this cold reaper who had killed several sequence 5s a week was a cold and profound blessed of Mr. Fool. He was a powerful and fear-inducing beyonder, but he was also someone whose inner feelings resembled an ordinary person. He was currently suffering from immense stress and was being eaten away by various kinds of negative emotions, slowly walking into an abyss of pain. After a few seconds of consideration, Audrey sincerely said, "If you are within my reach, it wouldn't be a problem." After her coming-of-age ceremony, she had obtained a certain level of autonomy. She could spend her holidays at her parents' family castle, or stay in Eastchester County's Stone City on her own. However, this freedom was still limited. She couldn't head anywhere she wanted. Even in Stone City, there were many areas she couldn't visit. This could only be circumvented if she joined certain charitable organizations of the Church of the Evernight Goddess. All right. Having grazed a traveler, Klein heaved a sigh of relief. He made the world reply, "You can confirm the location when the time comes and prepare the means to not expose your identity." Audrey tersely answered as a scene naturally surfaced in her mind. She and Mr. World would be in two separate compartments somewhere, with a wall or wooden board in between them as she conversed with him and administered treatment. In such a situation, Mr. World wouldn't be able to determine that it's me. To him, it doesn't matter as long as he's treated. This also means that if I can't make myself available, I can get Susie to do it. Mr. World definitely wouldn't believe that the one treating him is a dog. Oh, Susie doesn't know the existence of the Tarot Club. Unless it's necessary, I shouldn't get her to help Mr. World. As Audrey thought, she suddenly felt the joy from thinking up a prank as she went through a great deal of effort in order to stop the corners of her lips from curling up. After confirming this matter, Klein thought of another problem and got the World to look at Katlia. "Can you provide a crate of explosives?" He believed that as a pirate admiral, she definitely didn't lack the resources in obtaining them. "Yes." "When do you need it?" Katlia didn't ask why. With Gehrman Sparrow killing so many Sequence 5s, a crate of explosives was nothing. "Send it together with Broken Finger." Klein controlled the World to say, "How much will it cost?" Katlia replied without minding it, "Just treat it as a freebie for purchasing Broken Finger." A crate of explosives wasn't expensive at sea. They were even rather cheap. "I like that." The fool, Klein secretly said as he made the World nod and then remind everyone, "That picture from before, try your best not to recall it or even try to draw it when out in the real world." Audrey and the other members subconsciously glanced at the other end of the long bronze table and realized that Mr. Fool didn't say anything against it. They immediately turned serious and didn't dare to be careless. This also made Katlia's thoughts of writing to Queen Mystic Bernadette about this matter be placed on hold. She had to consider a suitable method that could avoid influencing factors. Following that, the free exchange segment slowly came to an end as the area above the gray fog fell silent. Returning back to the future, Katlia stood behind the window of the captain's cabin. She was clearly in a dilemma. Finally, she took a deep breath and exhaled. As she nudged her glasses, she left the captain's cabin and walked to Frank Lee's room. This first mate had been chased to the bottom cabin after the crew's unanimous vote. It was to prevent his experimental products from suddenly spreading. Frank Lee was rather pleased with this because his new residence was much more spacious. Furthermore, it also suited the condition of a dark environment. Knock. 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 Katlia came to the bottom cabin and rapped at the door. "Wait a moment." Frank Lee shouted a reply. It was unknown what he was busy on. After a minute, he opened the wooden door with his sleeves rolled up. He asked in puzzlement, "Captain, is there something?" Katlia didn't directly answer him as she used her night vision to peep into the pitch-black interior. She saw blue fish laid on the table with their eyes wide open. From the gap between the scales, green sprouts grew out. Some were already mature with an ear of wheat. "You succeeded?" Katlia held back her instinct to take a step back as she asked. Frank nodded in glee before shaking his head. "Not yet. But I've already made significant progress. I've crossbred wheat, mushrooms, and a bit of a rose bishop's cells, and I achieved a first-stage product. Placing them in the stomachs of fish, they will be able to absorb the flesh and blood to grow to maturity even without any light. But the current issue is that the target is supposed to be monster corpses. There's a need to prevent the poison and madness accumulated inside to not spread to the food after their flesh and blood is absorbed. Also, producing them is a problem. There's definitely not that many rose bishops who are willing to be material. Therefore, there's a need for them to have the ability to split and absorb flesh and blood themselves." After hearing Frank Lee's description, Katlia silently nudged her glasses. "Will such food begin to absorb flesh and blood and multiply while inside a human stomach after consumption?" Frank Lee fell into deep thought. After a few seconds, he said, "In theory, no. Because no one will eat them raw. I will have to test its activity under high temperatures. No, they still lack the ability to split themselves. It doesn't matter if they have any activity." Seeing Frank Lee in his confused state, Katlia fell into a dilemma again. After a while, she slowly asked, "I have a channel that allows me to obtain a druid's Beyonder characteristic. Do you need it?" Of course." Frank became thrilled. "Many a time, my abilities are what limit my ideas. I kind of regret it." Katlia suddenly had such a thought. Chapter 826, The Thought of Being Forgotten. Monday evening. 160 Buckland Street. Klein set up a ritual and summoned himself. He planned on investigating the secret hidden in the sewers. While responding above the gray fog, he was in a dilemma about the card to use, the Black Emperor or the Tyrant card. It was like the selection of clothes before heading out. In consideration of how Backland was a place where the Church of Storms was a very powerful faction, and being afraid that he would end up attracting high-sequence irascible brothers, Klein ultimately chose to use the Black Emperor card. He wore a crown and black armor with a cape behind him. Aside from this card of blasphemy, he also brought Creeping Hunger, Azek's copper whistle, Seigneur's gold coin, and Broken Finger, the Marauder Pathway's mystical item which Katlia had given him 3 hours ago, as well as some ordinary explosives. Of course, Klein didn't bring the entire crate of explosives. For a spirit body, it was just too heavy. He only took out 5 sticks and left Seigneur to hold them in his body. As for Death Knell, he had left it in his room. This was to prevent himself from having the urge to participate in a battle. He had very clear goals, so once he discovered any problems, to avoid danger, he would immediately leave and not stay behind. On the contrary, a powerful weapon would end up making him act bold, making him wish to probe deeper and resolve the matter by himself. This is Backland. It's best that I don't create too great a commotion. As for what's hidden in the sewers, I have no way of being clairvoyant about it. I can only divine whether it will be dangerous." Klein looked at the wall clock in his room, and he confirmed that there was another hour and a half before Hazel took action like she usually did. His figure suddenly vanished as he passed through the balcony's glass and flew into the streets before entering the sewers. In the dirty and humid environment, Klein took out a lone gold coin and made Wraith Seigneur appear in front of him with his dark red coat and old triangular hat. Following that, he handed over the tweezers that resembled 2 ground bone fingers to his marionette. Just holding it on him for a short period of time had nearly made him steal the sewer's manhole cover. Seigneur held Broken Finger and walked ahead. Dressed as the Black Emperor, Klein turned invisible and walked behind, allowing his marionette to open up a gap of at least 50 meters from him. With this distance between them, he was no longer affected by kleptomania, and as a dead person, Seigneur also lacked the thoughts of stealing. He didn't even have any thoughts. Turning in at the corresponding fork and passing through the hidden door, Wraith Seigneur held the grayish-white tweezer and appeared inside the half-natural, half-artificial cave. Unlike before, the oilskin-wrapped tools like shovels had changed positions. The hidden passage on the right had deepened a little. That was clearly Hazel's main focus. Right on the heels of that, Klein, who didn't enter the fork, leaned against the water of the sewers, his back facing the target region. He controlled his marionette as he walked deeper into the right passage. Soon, Seigneur came to the end. At this moment, Klein suddenly felt the grayish-white tweezer in his marionette's hand tremble subtly, as though it had been attracted by some unknown object not far away. The unknown item was deep and profound like a calm ocean. It made it difficult to pry into its exact state. A characteristic that's alive, much closer to that of a spirit. Klein was only able to determine this as he immediately let Seigneur use Mirror Leap to return to the half-natural, half-artificial cave, onto a shovel that hadn't rusted. He didn't attempt to head deeper underground via the passage. Then, Seigneur appeared again, took out the 5 ordinary sticks of explosives from inside its body, and placed them in different spots. Every wraith was a demolition expert. After doing all of this, Señor's figure phased away, appearing on the surface of the gold coin in Klein's hand. As he stuffed the gold coin into his body, Klein raised his right hand, in preparation to snap his fingers and trigger the 5 sticks of explosives. His idea was very simple. It was to deliver an explosion of a suitable scale in order to destroy Hazel's hard work and traces. It would attract the Nighthawks and resolve everything. This way, regardless of what was hidden deep in the passage, it wouldn't bring him danger. In Backlund, knowing how to ingeniously sound the alarm was more effective and safer than rashly attacking by himself. This was especially so when Klein wasn't capable of determining that the matter involved a demigod. "I'm such a good citizen." As Klein gave a self-deprecating remark, he prepared to snap his fingers to ignite the explosives. Suddenly, his head swayed a little as he lowered his arm, as though nothing had happened. The cautious Klein immediately ended the summoning and returned above the gray fog. Then, he returned to the real world and entered his physical body. Just as he was about to busy himself to bring back Creeping Hunger, Señor's gold coin, and the other items from the mysterious space above the gray fog, he frowned slightly. He seriously recalled the entire process of his late-night exploration when he was alarmed to realize that he had apparently lost a small portion of his memories. He didn't remember if he had triggered the 5 sticks of ordinary explosives. As he turned his head to sense his surroundings and confirmed that the entire street was very silent, Klein began to believe that he hadn't snapped his fingers. This is a beyonder power of a dream stealer. It seems to be much stronger than Mobit. If not for the gray fog and my habit of doing an after-action review, I might not have discovered that my thoughts of triggering the explosives were stolen away. The other party might have also snapped his fingers, but without the flame-controlling powers to work in concert, nothing happened. Klein's expression turned grave as he thought, prepared to make another attempt. Similarly, to prevent himself from being tracked, he still summoned himself and responded to himself. With the Black Emperor card, Klein left 160 Backlund Street from another side, deliberately circling 2 streets away before arriving at the sewer's manhole. This time, he didn't approach the fork. Staying not far from the manhole, he used his enhanced flame controlling to sense the explosive and lifted his right hand. He raised it and lowered it as Klein rapidly ended the summoning and returned above the gray fog to prevent himself from being attacked by an unknown existence. Not in a hurry to return to the real world, he sat at the chair of the world, doing a debrief of the entire process. "I forgot to trigger the explosives again. If I didn't force myself to recall this, I wouldn't have even considered such a problem. Truly quite impressive. The one that steered Hazel to the sewers to dig is probably a demigod. Why didn't he directly parasitize Hazel? Could it be due to particular reasons that he's sealed somewhere in the sewers and can only release some of his powers to drive Hazel to help him via a dream? The one that caused Broken Fingers to react abnormally via the law of beyonder characteristic convergence is also him? He is unable to control the signs in regards to this?" Klein thought as he wrapped the corner of the long model table. After having a rough guess, he discovered that there was apparently no way of truly carrying out his original plans. This was because his thoughts would be stolen once he entered the distance in which he could use flame controlling to ignite the explosives. Even if he recalled it later, there was no way to make up for it. Considering how Hazel would be affected by her dream, Klein suspected that the limits to the person's powers didn't stop at the manhole. If he discovered that hero bandit Black Emperor was related to Dwayne Dantes, then he would lose his corresponding thoughts and memories even while sleeping in his bedroom. However, he has no way of locking onto me by passing over the gray fog. Does he think it's so easy to stop me from sounding the alarm? Klein thought as he cautiously summoned a paper figurine and used a tiny amount of the powers of the mysterious space above the gray fog. With the ritual that had yet been terminated, he conjured an angel and forcefully created an interference effect. After doing this, he carried the Black Emperor card and entered his bedroom with his door of summoning. Klein's new plan was to head to another street, find a random house, and borrow some pen and paper to write. At the end of the 6th left fork in the Backlund Street sewers, there's a secret passage that's suspected to hide a demigod from the Marauder pathway, or something similar. Then, with the image of Backlund Street, he would plaster the piece of paper on St. Samuel Cathedral's entrance as a public notice. Of course, he would politely knock on the door to let the bishops inside sense it to prevent ordinary people from first seeing it. At times, the most primitive methods are the most effective ones. Just as Klein was about to leave 160 Buckland Street from another area, he suddenly felt a tremor as a deep rumble sounded from afar. It was ignited? The explosives were ignited? Who did it? Klein paused in surprise. It was definitely not done by him, as it couldn't have been delayed for so long. And previously, there wasn't anyone in the sewers. Even if there was someone, the thought of igniting the explosives would be stolen away. Unless a demigod happened to come. But how could it be this coincidental? There's another possibility. It was done by the demigod from the Marauder pathway. He had repeatedly stolen my thoughts before, preventing me from using flame controlling. It was to buy time to leave. Now that it's finally done, he triggered the explosives to destroy all the evidence. That adheres to logic, as he should know very well that a powerful being whose origins can't be traced cannot be stopped if he insists on sounding the alarm. The best solution is to drop its tail in order to survive, just like a gecko. However, if he can leave, why did he steer Hazel into digging the secret passage? Doing so will deal tremendous harm to him? Klein thought of certain possibilities, but he was unable to verify any of them. Furthermore, he was certain that the underground explosion was bound to have already attracted attention. Hence, he immediately left creeping hunger and other items behind, terminated the summoning, and returned above the gray fog. After returning to the real world, he stopped the ritual, cleared the altar, and cleaned all traces before getting into bed. 39 Buckland Street, Member of Parliament Mock's house. Hazel, who didn't sleep at all, was alarmed by the tremors and deep humming sound. She walked to the balcony and drew the curtains to look towards the sewer manhole. However, she didn't notice any anomalies. After observing for a while, the uncertain her had decided to cancel her operation for the night and sleep in peace. At this moment, she suddenly heard squeaking as she turned to look at the corner of her balcony. At some point in time, there was a gray rat sitting there covered in sewage water. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.